Just gotta work hard at it to impress your grandkids with a tall tale that you can tell them, huh? It's gotta be it. Number 8. Let's just keep count. Keep count in the chat. We're gonna go on with the show, but this is our little side quest. You know, in WoW, it's like, retrieve 16 boar tusks and bring them back to the quest giver. And it's like, okay, I've got to go out there, get the stuff, bring it back. Get 16 accounts banned in a streamer's channel. Alright. Now we begin with the Agent Smith segment, World Discussion. This is episode 45, I think. And we welcome Mr. Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
Hey, not much. How have you been?
Well, it's been a while because my sleep rhythm has been basically totally opposite of what it should be. But business has been good though. The plus side is the audience is international, so you can kind of just wake up and stream, and either it's more for Europe or it's more for the Americas, and it's been really good business-wise. The year's off to a ridiculously amazing start. There have been a couple big breakthroughs that kind of lined up near the end of last year that have been converging here, so that's super awesome. How have you been?
Cool. Oh, I've been fine. Just been doing the usual.
Yep.
Got a couple scripts done on some episodes, so that's coming along.
Nice. Yeah, I filed my taxes the other day, so I kind of totaled the stuff that you've earned over 2018, because you're a contractor. I've contracted you for this expert segment. It's pretty cool. It makes me feel very official, like I'm a business owner and I've got someone helping me out for stuff.
That's probably the fanciest title I've ever had.
Nice. So it's been like, I don't know, 3 weeks? I don't know if we've done... Did we do one episode so far this year?
I think we did sneak in one after Christmas.
Yeah. So quite a bit has happened. The first thing that kind of pops into my head is for the Mueller meme, there's another guy who's arrested.
Yeah, I think that was Roger Stone.
Yeah, that's the name.
If I'm remembering correctly. Yeah, he got arrested because he lied about some communications he had with WikiLeaks during the 2016 presidential campaign. And he also apparently lied about keeping records of that communication. So that's kind of what they're tagging him with. Mm-hmm. It's not clear right now how much more there is to that, but it kind of made the news because that's kind of the closest the Mueller investigation has come publicly to illustrating how the Trump campaign may have colluded with the Russian government in some fashion. So basically the theory is in the media that maybe they did it through WikiLeaks, basically, because it's kind of known that the Russian government has kind of shoveled some information, some hacked resources and whatnot into WikiLeaks, and so they kind of use that as a mouthpiece, so to speak. Not like a propaganda piece, but they kind of use that as an outlet. And so the thinking is that maybe through Roger Stone, the Trump campaign may have coordinated with some contacts in WikiLeaks who were proxies of the Russian government. But that's just a theory. That's pure speculation at this point, and it might not go anywhere, which I would still maintain is the most likely outcome. But there was some brief excitement over that for that reason.
We have quite a few new viewers today. We're at like over 1,000 right now, so some people probably haven't listened to a lot of these other segments we've had, but the Mueller stuff has come up lots and lots of times, and I think as a bystander and an observer of all this developing, there's almost the desire to see a drama unfold that has an exposition, some key characters, rising action, a climax, and then a big thing that happens when a lot of stuff, if you're talking about government and bureaucracy, can have a really boring end to it, which I guess some drama and media does that too, but there's always that desire of like, oh man, stuff is really gonna go out of control here soon. Well, maybe.
Yeah, it tends to be pretty anticlimactic. You know, it's I mean, investigating a president is pretty unprecedented, and so that's probably not the direction the investigation is going. You know, it's not really clear, again, just what they're looking at, but even if they did find something that linked the president, or something incriminating that linked the president to any kind of collusion, the further course of action would not be entirely clear. Because, again, there's not a lot of precedent for that. And, you know, there's all of the politics involved on top of that. So I don't really think there's going to be, like, a big bang at the end of the investigation. You know, most likely it's going to be probably more like the Kavanaugh investigation. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. You know, you remember him, right? He was the big Supreme Court guy who had the prolonged, what would you call it? The proper name escapes me, but the hearings, the congressional hearings.
Yeah, he's the guy who lied about what the different sexual positions are called. That was...
Well, I don't know if I would go by Urban Dictionary on that count. I don't know if you can convict somebody for perjury on something like that.
Well, I know that, but come on, dude.
But yeah, that's the guy.
That's the guy.
That's the guy. So yeah, I think kind of similar to that, well, more accurately, more specifically, the FBI investigation into him, which was very truncated, but kind of similar to that in that they weren't really able to find a lot of substance. You know, they found some evidence, but not enough to really be conclusive. So that's probably, I suspect, what the Mueller investigation will find vis-a-vis Trump himself and the overall Trump campaign. They're getting a lot of people who on unrelated things, but nothing that really points directly to explicit collusion. Again, Roger Stone is kind of the closest they've come yet, but the exact links there and who knew what when, so to speak, that's not clear yet. So we'll see. We'll see where the investigation goes and what they find, but I don't have high expectations for it. Oh, was there anything else that caught your eye?
No. Was there anything that caught yours?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things. We can kind of get into them here.
Go for it.
Well, yeah, we always get questions, so we've kind of trended towards a format where we kind of talk a little bit at the start about stuff that's happening and then get into the questions. So if there's too many questions, though, I tend to kind of cut it short. So I'm just trying to judge how many we have thus far. Well, one of the things that kind of happened was that the United States started negotiating with the Taliban. For those who don't remember, there is still technically a war in Afghanistan. It's easy to forget here in the U.S. because it doesn't make the news very much, but that is still going on. U.S. involvement is relatively minor now compared to what it used to be, so it's not nearly as much, but it's still pretty key as far as the maintenance of a status quo in the conflict between the two main parties, that being the Afghan government and the Taliban. So there's been some substantive peace negotiations going on with the Taliban that hadn't really been happening before. And there's rumors, there was some media talk about a negotiation where basically the U.S. would agree to pull out within, I think, like a year or two or something. And in exchange, the Taliban would agree to prevent al-Qaeda from using Afghanistan as a quote-unquote safe haven. Which is probably what the U.S. government should have been asking for from the start. But, you know, we have kind of an institutional can-do attitude in the U.S. government. And the result is that things sometimes get done the hard way when they don't need to be. So, regardless of whether or not it should have happened before, that's kind of where it seems to be heading. It's not clear if it'll actually go anywhere, though, because Taliban may want to drag things out, and it's not clear if they're entirely genuine about the negotiation. You could say the same about the United States government, for that matter, but nominally there are negotiations happening, and that's a positive sign in and of itself. And the fact that there are specifics being released about what's being negotiated is also a positive sign. I mean, given that the United States is mostly in Afghanistan specifically because of al-Qaeda, the idea of a al-Qaeda-centered agreement kind of makes sense. There's probably going to be a lot more to the agreement, though. I imagine the U.S. would also ask that the Taliban, to some degree, respect the existing Afghan government and reach some kind of peace deal with them. I don't know how interested they are in that, but if there is some power sharing deal, they might be willing to sign on. And at this point, the U.S. could also kind of point to the Islamic State in Afghanistan as a kind of common enemy. The Islamic State and the Taliban work together sometimes, but they're not really on the same page. They are kind of rival organizations, and there has been a fair amount of fighting between them in Afghanistan over the past few years. So that could be a point of common cause that could come up in the negotiations. We'll see, but it was definitely something that caught my eye, so to speak. That's definitely a signal that we haven't seen much in terms of peace in Afghanistan. So there was that. There was also Syria that's been in the news a bit. I think late last year, the Trump administration made some surprising promises that the U.S. would pull out of Syria completely within like a month or something. And so the fallout from that is basically the Trump administration slowly walking that back. It's pretty much been what they've been doing for the past month and change, just kind of slowly, not completely pulling back from it, but watering it down significantly. And I suspect that's kind of the influence of administration insiders. You know, generally the way it works is Trump himself says something outlandish that has a significant policy repercussions, and then people in the administration kind of work around him or through him or whatever they got to do to kind of walk it back and water it down to the point where it is kind of palatable.
Well, the thing that
traditional stakeholders
that offsets that persistent problem is that he says so much so often that it's kind of hard to hold him accountable for any single one of like, okay, well, you said this, so is that going to happen? Because then he said something else, and it's like, wow, that's big. Like, well, this has huge implications. And then just as you're about to hold him accountable to that, then, wow, he just said another thing that's really big. What if this happens? He's talked about the wall a bunch. Actually, the government shutdown, I guess, is the big one that we've kind of... It's happened while we haven't had a session, but we haven't talked about it. Was it any different this time? Because I know that government shutdown is kind of a frequent thing. And for someone who doesn't know a ton about government, like, what does that mean? Because I have some regular supporters of the channel who work for the government, and a lot of people in different branches have to continue working without pay during that time, which sucks.
Yeah. Well, basically, every year, Congress kind of has to come up with a budget for the government, and this is Cliff Notes version. This is a grossly simplified version of what actually happens, but basically Congress convenes and discusses, negotiates, and agrees to a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. And if no agreement can be reached, then nobody gets paid. I mean, it's pretty much as simple as that. Generally, historically, the government has been Congress has been very good about meeting the deadline to have a new budget for a given fiscal year. But over the past 20-some years, it's been used more as a negotiating tactic. There's been generally it's been the Republican Party. I think the Democratic Party did it once, the time before last, I think it was. But back in the 90s, the Gingrich Congress, or Gingrich House of Representatives, I guess it was, they used it to shut it down for a while, to put pressure on the Clinton administration and Democrats in Congress to try to implement their Contract for America policy platform, which was basically cuts to government spending and getting the deficit down, things like that. And then, basically stuff like that. I won't go through the whole history of shutdowns. I don't even know if I can remember it all, but the gist of it is the Republican Party, in the cases where it's been the party responsible, will withhold its vote, so to speak. It will basically veto any budget in order to put pressure on the Democrats in order to give concessions. The idea being that Republicans basically don't care as much about having an open government, and so it doesn't matter as much to them, so they have leverage. In practice, it hasn't really worked like that. There are certainly stalwarts in the Republican Party who kind of do think like that, but the people who are more moderate, more closer to the center of the political spectrum, generally don't appreciate it much. So generally, whichever party has started a shutdown has kind of lost political capital by doing it. It's generally not a winner. But it kind of keeps happening because there are people who really think that compromise is a bad word, or that there's already been too much compromise, and they want to really apply pressure to try to get what they want. There's been a lot of that in Washington over the past 20-some years. It's one of the reasons partisanship has gotten so bad up there. But yeah, that's basically what it is. That's sort of the short version of what a government shutdown here in the U.S. is. And this year it was a little different in so much as what it was over, because generally a government shutdown is more about government spending, like overall spending. You know, how much of a fiscal deficit do we want, etc. But the last time and this time it was more about Trump's wall. I think that was more specifically what it was about: funding for the construction of a wall along the U.S. border with Mexico. And there was a lot of people in the Democratic Party who really were dead set opposed to that, and there was a lot of people in the Republican Party who were very dead set on having it. So that kind of created a game of chicken that, of course, everybody lost, basically. Technically, the government is now open. There was an agreement reached, but it's not actually over yet. That is to say, the dispute isn't over yet. Excuse me. Actually, it's the agreement reached to end the shutdown this time is only good for 3 weeks. And that itself isn't that uncommon, because actually something that you've seen perpetually almost over the past 10 years is near shutdowns. There have been kind of threats to shut down the government, and so then the result is temporary agreements to keep the government open for 3 months, 4 months, whatever. And so then there's sort of these recurring budget bills to keep the government open that happen throughout the year, rather than just having one big budget bill at the beginning of the year, which has normally been the case over the course of U.S. history. So that's actually been a lot more common than just having an explicit shutdown. So we might well see a return to that, keep that going. They actually, I think, did have an actual budget bill last year, or maybe the year before that. Chat can keep me honest on that. But yeah, this year, with this shutdown, it ended with a 3-week delay, basically. They agreed to open it up for 3 weeks, and then the Trump administration's position is basically that if there isn't an agreement by then, that they'll basically declare a state of declare an emergency anyway, and then try to build the ball with some kind of emergency funding. So that's going to be a big deal when it happens, and I kind of think it will, because Lindsey Graham is a senior Republican in Congress. That was actually his idea. His suggestion to the Trump administration was to temporarily reopen the government for a few weeks to kind of take the pressure off government workers and to kind of appease people in the political center who were upset about the shutdown. And then, basically, if no agreement at that point, after that 3 weeks could end, then kind of push the big red button and use the nuclear option. So the Trump administration seems to be following that game plan, which means in, I guess, about 2 weeks, there's going to be a big shitstorm in the news about a quote-unquote national emergency. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, have they fleshed out specifics of, like, the architecture of the thing? Or is this still, like, in the symbolism category? Because it's been kind of tough to tell if he's just doing this to posture, to drum up support, or if he physically actually is trying to make the wall happen and the party also wants that.
I think the party definitely wants it, or at least the portion of the party that is hardcore Trump supporting. Obviously, every party has different factions, but I think in general the party would be for it. As for, I mean, there's always posturing. Everything to do in politics is posturing, but I don't think it's just posturing in this case. I think he actually would do it. I suspect. Because I think, and the reason I say that is because I think technically, legally, he can do that. There's a website called Lawfare that had an article on it, and they kind of went into the specifics, and I think technically they can do it. And I think I've got some notes on it. Maybe I can try to dig that up here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. Well, first of all, the executive branch always has a lot of discretionary power in determining and defining what constitutes a national emergency. So right away the law is kind of leaning towards the executive branch in that regard. If the executive branch under whatever president says that something is an emergency, judicially speaking, judges will kind of defer to them on that, because the definition of an emergency, what constitutes an emergency, is kind of something that's hard to pin down definitionally. It's kind of subjective and depends on circumstances. So right away, the president could kind of use that but there are limits to it. So you do kind of have to point to, some specifics. And so in that regard, they actually do have some precedent, some legislation they can use. I think, where is it? I was thinking about just making this a podcast episode because I had so much on it. So there's a lot of meat here to get into. Well, basically, if there is an emergency, according to this obscure bit of, legalese somewhere in the Constitution or law or wherever it was, can't find it specifically right now, but basically, if there is an emergency, technically, the president can use funds to build, if I'm remembering it correctly, it was fencing or other infrastructure necessary for the military defense of the U.S. or for operations that require the use of the military. So technically, he kind of set the stage for that by deploying the military just before the election to the border. And for those of you not familiar with that, there was a lot of talk before the midterm elections last November about an emergency at the border. And technically, the military was deployed to the border. So technically, the Trump administration could argue that the military, there is military operations occurring at the border that necessitate funding, and that if there's an emergency, then they could kind of tap that clause in order to divert some funding to them for which they could build some infrastructure. There's going to be a lot of legal juggling in that because they didn't actually deploy troops to the border, if I'm remembering correctly. Because for those of you not from the United States, and maybe some of you that are, it's not really technically legal to deploy U.S. troops within U.S. borders. It's okay to station them here and base them here, but there are very strict restrictions on how you can use federal troops within U.S. borders. Generally, when you see troops being deployed per se, it's National Guard troops, which are technically state militia. And that's kind of more what happens when you hear about troops being deployed to the border and whatnot. Generally, those are actually state militia, quote unquote, from that state being deployed, being directed by the federal government. But in this case, it wasn't National Guard. I think it was actually Army Corps of Engineers and then some transport planes. And the transport planes were being used to help ferry Border Patrol people to and fro. So more of a logistical thing. But the Trump administration, like any administration would, they kind of spun it as troops. So they said, we're deploying quote-unquote troops to the border. But that kind of, when you think of troops, you think of infantry, and that's not really what was sent. It wasn't infantry, really. But the point is, they sent down the Army Corps of Engineers, that's the more relevant bit. And they kind of put up some fencing, if I remember correctly. And I think the specific legal clause in the relevant law specifically references fencing. And I kind of wonder if maybe that isn't why you started talking about slats. Have you seen that?
Mm-mm.
So one of the things he started talking about late last year after the midterms, maybe even before it, I don't remember exactly. Instead of talking about a wall, he started referring to quote-unquote big, giant, beautiful slats. Something to that effect.
Big giant. Was he trying to appeal to Texans or something? I guess that's where it would go. We like big stuff. For people who don't know, we like big things.
I think part of the reason he might have done that, I don't know for sure, is maybe that it's easier to define slats as a fence rather than a wall. I mean, just in the name, calling it a wall, it's not a fence then. So I think slats might be a way to kind of get around that. I'm not entirely doing this issue justice, because I've got like a page plus of notes on this, and I don't want to kind of just sit down and read through it all. But basically, that's the gist of it. The takeaway is that there is technically legal grounds that the president could use to actually divert funding and use the military to build something, slats, a fence, whatever, on the border. So technically, he could do this. And what Congress could do is, because again, national emergency is very subjective. How do you define that? Blah, blah, blah. Technically, there are laws on the books that give Congress the power to rein in the executive branch if it abuses its authority in terms of national emergencies. There's actually a whole shit ton of national emergencies that are in effect right now. And a lot of them are very obscure and random, and nobody really cares about them because they don't really get used for much. It kind of became a bureaucratic maneuver, especially in the 60s and 70s, to declare an emergency. A lot of them were quote-unquote economic emergencies, so it's not that uncommon. But part of the pushback against that was some legislation that gave Congress the ability to basically end a national emergency if it saw fit. So hypothetically, if the Trump administration did try to declare a national emergency that the broader public did not think was an actual emergency and was being done purely for political reasons, Congress does have the power to stop that. But the question is, are there enough votes in Congress to do that? And probably not, because I suspect that there is a pretty significant constituency of voters in the US who actually do believe that the border is sufficiently unprotected enough to warrant the declaration of an emergency. And if that's the case, then there's probably not going to be enough politicians in Washington to get the votes you would need to overturn the declaration of a national emergency. Therein lies the rub. So that's kind of where it's going to be. I think there's probably going to be a lot of lawsuits. I mean, no surprise for the U.S., but in this case especially, given how controversial it'll be when they do it, or I should say if they do it, because I don't know that they will. I think they will, though. And if they do, there's going to be a shit ton of lawsuits, and it'll probably get dragged out in court. Hypothetically, Congress could shut it down, but again, I don't think there's going to be enough votes for that. And I think the Trump administration might well be happy with it being stuck in the courts, because then they can kind of use it as an election issue. You know, if it does just drag out for years, then they can bring it up in 2020 when Trump is running for re-election, and he can say, hey, I tried to build the wall, but you know, all these Democrats and the judges aren't letting me, so you should vote more Republicans in and vote for me so that I can cut through all of this bullshit and finally get it done. So that's probably how he'll spin it, and if it gets stuck in the courts like that, it's pretty viable. A viable political strategy, I mean. I suspect being an emergency, he hypothetically could push it through, since that is kind of what the declaration of emergency is about. But again, I think they would probably prefer for it to be stuck in the courts so that they can have it as a running issue to point to and run on. But that's where it's at. That's a sort of Cliff Notes version of the issue in question. Now might be a good time for the usual disclaimer. Especially since we have a lot of new people. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. You may have already noticed. I have a stronger background in some things than others, so I definitely am prone to mistakes, biases, etc., and I definitely encourage participation from chat in terms of correcting me and pointing out anything I say that's wrong, stupid, biased, you know, etc. So in that sense, chat's input is very much welcome. It is kind of meant to be more of an exchange in that regard. And I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will kind of see what you say when I kind of sit down to do that. So
I've been getting a lot of positive feedback from a lot of the new viewers from what I've been seeing.
That's nice.
There are always a few people who are making a ruckus, but I have to deal with that all the time, so I feel like it's almost just kind of the culture of being on the internet. Is there going to be some people who are like, that's so stupid, bruh. So,
well, that's what the internet is for.
Yeah.
Well, that's what it used to be for anyway. I guess it's changing now.
Well, some people still use it that way. Yeah, it's a little bit less Wild West.
There's all this positive energy on Reddit now, and it just disturbs me. I don't like it. I miss the Wild West days. I liked it when it was more surly and angry.
Yeah.
But that's just me. It probably is better for everybody if it is kind of mild. And to be fair, it's a way different demographic now. You know, the internet is definitely broadened to broader society, so it's not sort of the reserve for the social malcontent like it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
It is more an internet for everybody, and as such, it's kind of evolving to reflect that. So I'm not too bitter about it, but I do reminisce sometimes.
Yeah, we had a bit of a conversation today before the segment where sometimes you forget that people are animals, and then someone says something, and you're like, oh yeah, now I remember. We are risen apes. Okay, so this gives some context for why someone is doing this or taking a stand. Another example would be when you're watching people drive on the road and being like, How are you so bad at operating this motor vehicle? Oh, yeah. Okay, okay. I
Yeah,
see now.
patience is important. If you're going to go through life being angry all the time, you're going to have a tough life. Or a short one, depending on the circumstances.
Yeah,
But
it's
let's see.
identifying stuff that's outside of your sphere of control and kind
Mm,
of just treating that as effectively your setting rather than something that you feel like everything must change as I think it should. Which
hmm
maybe you think a lot of things should be different, and it's fine to share your opinions, but there's also the ability to temper that with realism of what can I physically influence with my actions and my
hmm
words, engaging your expectations accordingly.
hmm Yeah, that's just that's a big part of kind of growing up and maturing. Kind of recognizing that and adjusting accordingly. Some are better at it than others.
Well, yeah, you have the young adult who comes into their 20s with a ton of fire of like there's all this stuff that's wrong in the world and people need to know about this and I'm going to tell them about this and we're going to change it, and then you get into the system and it's like, man, this is a mess. I don't even know where to start. What are they doing? I don't even know.
Mm.
And then you're like, okay, well, it's more tangled than I thought it was, and I can't really do too much about it, so I guess life goes on.
Yeah, it can be very intimidating. But I can kind of respect that to a degree because there are some people that keep plowing on and just kind of can't quite get over it. They still just keep plowing away, and I can respect passion, but take it easy. Don't hurt yourself. Let's see. So yeah, Syria. I didn't on Syria. The Trump administration has kind of been walking back that what would I call it? That tweet, I guess, that Twitter policy announcement about withdrawal, and they're supposedly negotiating with Turkey about some kind of 20-mile demilitarized zone, buffer zone between the Kurdish territory and Turkish territory. Although that might involve some Turks being deployed into territory bordering the Kurdish territory and Syrian territory, kind of along that Euphrates River there. That's all speculation, though, so it's not really clear where those negotiations are going. Certainly, there was a big pushback from institutional actors in the U.S. government when the announcement was made because they didn't want to hang the Kurds out to dry again, because that's happened before. And so they kind of really wanted to push Trump himself to try to kind of condition that withdrawal on the Turks promising not to go after the Kurds in a particularly violent fashion. And Turks kind of not really into that. Turkish government really kind of wants to get in there and maybe not just wipe them out, but certainly would replace the leading political actors in that particular region with pro-Turkish rebel groups or some alternative besides the Kurdish YPG and SDF. And I think Trump dealt with Turkish recalcitrants with his usual grace. I believe he said that he would devastate Turkey economically if they didn't agree. I don't think the Turks were real keen on that either. In fact, I think Erdogan came out and explicitly rejected it. So that went about as well as it was going to. So for now, those negotiations are ongoing. I'm not sure where they're going to go. I suspect that the Pentagon would be perfectly content if they were just kind of dragged out, because then they could just stay in Syria, and then Trump could pretend to be trying to pull out. So then everybody kind of gets something that they want. But for now, that's an open question. One of the big problems with the resolution of the Syrian conflict, and there are many, many problems, don't get me wrong, but one of the problems is that the US government hasn't really made a decision yet. It doesn't really have a Syria policy. Its Syria policy for the past few years has basically just been exist there as a factor. But beyond that, they don't really do much that's very decisive. There was for a while the anti-Islamic State focus. That was there for a while, but now that that's over, they've kind of gone back to being aimless. Pretty much nobody wants to leave completely because they want to have some leverage in terms of peace negotiations and what the ultimate outcome is of the conflict, but there's a lot of debate about how involved they should be in terms of that occupation, in terms of that involvement. So there's just no consensus, and that makes it difficult for the other actors involved in the conflict to reach some kind of accord or agreement or understanding, because they don't really know who has leverage or what the United States is going to do or not do. It's just a big disequilibrium. There's a lot of instability in that key variable there that affects the rest of the equation. So there's that. That was kind of big in the news for the past month. But then the other thing with Syria is that the Arabs are actually starting to get warm to Assad again. And they'd always been kind of cool on him, but now that it's clear that they're not going to overthrow him, the Saudis are kind of trying to take more of a carrot approach instead of a stick approach. And for that, I guess I should explain that. We might have some non-native English speakers. That refers to a phrase, carrot and stick approach. And that refers to a way of negotiating with someone, trying to incentivize someone to do something. And the carrot is sort of the positive incentive, where you try to give them something that they want if they agree to do something that you want. And then the stick is where you threaten them. You're threatening to do something to them if they don't do what you want. So carrot and stick approach is where you balance threats with incentives.
And just so everyone is clear, this analogy, I'm guessing, is for the treatment of horses is how it originated, because some people might be listening and they're saying, well, I like sticks more than carrots, and they're just confused. But horses prefer carrots to sticks. So the carrot is the positive, the stick is the negative, just so we're clear on the history of this turn of phrase.
Yeah, thank you. That's well, no, really, that's legitimately useful, for people not familiar with the term. In this case, the stick was very much the intervention in the civil war and the escalation of the civil war. Obviously, the Saudis, among other groups, kind of intervened and supported this, that, and the other rebel group against the Assad government, because they didn't like the fact that the Assad government was allied with Iran, which of course is the big major rival for the Saudis, if not the Gulf monarchies in general. So they tried to pressure him out with that. That hasn't worked, so now they're kind of shifting back to more of a carrot approach. They're offering to help in the reconstruction of Syria, and there's going to be a lot of reconstructing given how destructive the conflict's been. They're offering to kind of help pay for that if he kind of warms up to them in return. And it's not clear how effective that's going to be, because obviously the Syrian government has a lot of reasons to be a little bitter about what's happened over the course of the civil war. But on the other hand, it's money. Money talks in the Middle East. And Iran, I don't know, really has a lot to offer in that regard, given the state of its economy. And I don't know that Russia really wants to pay for Syrian reconstruction either, because they're not in the best shape either. So, on the one hand, they've been enemies, but on the other hand, it's a workable solution. Honestly, Assad would probably do pretty well to consider breaking relations with Iran at this point, because it's probably been more trouble than it's worth, diplomatically speaking. I could be wrong on that. I'm certainly open to criticism, and I welcome anybody, chat's input on that, but I don't really see how much Syria really gains from being on the Saudi shit list, especially given that it just resulted in a giant-ass civil war that almost overthrew the regime. So if they can get on better terms with some of the governments that tried to overthrow them, that seems like a win-win. I mean, they get money for reconstruction, and they don't have to worry about any such things happening again in the future. That seems like a better alternative. But on the other hand, there's just not a lot of trust there, which is kind of prerequisite to such a major shift in diplomatic alignment. And the Russians have kind of shown that they're at least somewhat reliable, in so much as they kind of came to help the regime. Kind of took them a while. It started in 2011, and the Russians didn't kind of jump in until 2015, but they did kind of come in eventually. And then Iran also helped, although very much for self-interested reasons. The big sticking point is probably the Golan Heights, because that's a bit of Syrian territory that's been occupied by the Israelis since the, Six-Day War, I want to say. And the Syrian government very much wants that back. And that's one of those sensitive political issues over there. Territory is always sensitive in the Middle East. And so, Israel in general the Israel-Palestine issue is used by a lot of authoritarian governments in the Middle East as a kind of crutch. You know, authoritarian governments will say, hey, we're fighting for the Palestinians and, you know, taking a hard line on the Israelis, so you should continue to support our government so that we can keep doing that. Never mind modernization or economic opportunity or political pluralism or any of that stuff. That's all bullshit. Just keep supporting us so we can keep pushing on Israel. You know, that kind of logic, basically. And the Golan Heights is kind of tied into that. You know, that's one of those emotive issues for Syrians, where it's their territory and they deserve to have it back, and Israel's illegitimate in the first place. So it just ties into a lot of regional geopolitics in that sense. And so it would be hard then for the Syrian government to kind of, in part, base its legitimacy on its opposition to Israel and then turn around and basically defect to Israel's faction, because the Saudis and the Israelis are basically on the same side at this point. They don't like to be really open about it, but de facto there has been a kind of reconciliation between the Saudi government and the Israeli government. So there is kind of rapprochement, a kind of concord there that's sort of unspoken. But if they could get over that, if the Syrian government could get over that hang-up, and if they think they could maintain power without disturbing their population too much, that could be a viable move for them, and that might yet happen. But it's, you know, early days yet. And again, pure speculation on my part. That's just one possible outcome. God knows there's any number of possible outcomes with Syria, given how complex the conflict has become. But that's possible. That's a possible direction. But that was an interesting change, because I had kind of thought that the Saudis and the Israelis would probably take a much harder line on Syria. Because the big thing for them right now is not so much the Assad government, it's more the fact that the Iranians are stationing military units in Syria now, to a degree and in a way that they kind of hadn't been doing before the Syrian civil war. So I think the Saudis and Israelis are much more focused on that at this point. And part of the reason they're taking a softer line on Syria is specifically because they want to try to convince them to push the Iranians out, and to give them an opportunity to be less dependent on the Iranians for economic aid. You know, they're kind of presenting themselves as an alternative in that vein. Again, I don't know if it'll work, but that's kind of the gist of it. So we'll see where that goes. Hopefully that'll kind of reduce tensions and there can be some kind of peace settlement to kind of finally bring the damn thing to a close, because God knows it's dragged on too long. But for now, that's sort of the latest in Syria news. So there was that. Kind of dragging this out a bit, so I guess I'll skip to questions, because I know they're piling up here.
Heaps of questions.
Sorry, what?
Heaps of questions.
Let's see. Tariffs, good or bad for our economy? You know, if you want the textbook economic answer, the textbook economic answer is that they're bad for the economy, because they act as a drag on economic activity and they prevent the most efficient production and allocation of resources. But the thing is, when people judge the economy, they're not really judging it based on economic efficiency or growth. They're judging it more on how it benefits them, how well they're doing as an individual, and then based on a host of other sort of abstract factors, like how well a certain group or industry is. You know, there's a lot of support and sentiment in support of the U.S. manufacturing sector, because that's seen as a sort of signifier of national strength, if not national dignity. So the health of the manufacturing sector is kind of used as a proxy by a lot of people, as a proxy for the health of the overall economy, which is not really an accurate reading of the manufacturing sector at this point, but that's just how a lot of people do that. So, but using that metric, using those sort of alternative metrics to gauge the health of the economy, in that sense, you could argue that tariffs are good, because they can protect a specific industry, or they can provide more job security to a particular industry, or, you know, whatever alternative goal you have besides maximum efficiency. You could then argue that tariffs are good in that sense. Or perhaps in a strategic sense. National security is another angle that you could use. You know, tariffs could keep out the goods and services of a national rival of some kind, in a way that prevents their economic actors from gaining strategic leverage over you by making you economically dependent on some of their exports. So in that sense, tariffs could be good. But just in general, they're not good for the economy. That is a drag. People in general would be wealthier without them, overall. And over the long term, obviously there's a transition period there that would probably be hard. But over the long term and in general, better off without them. but we still have them because there are other factors involved with tariffs than just purely economic matters.
Well, I was under the impression that it was mainly a symbolic effort. Because you're trying to paint a rival for yourself and try to basically showcase that you're willing to take a stand against a rival in a way that is supposed to assist the local business worker in person to benefit them. That was my impression of why he's kind of pushing that.
Well, whether or not the current tariffs that are being implemented and used by the Trump administration are good for the economy, that's a different question than are tariffs in general good or bad for the economy. I assumed that he was asking the latter and not the former.
Right.
The former is like, that's a whole other discussion. And that's difficult to get into because that gets into how specific industries have been impacted and the national security merits of tariffs. And, again, like you say, the political aspect, whether or not it's grandstanding. I mean, like I said earlier, it's always grandstanding. That's always a part of everything every politician does. But the question is how much more, in addition to the grandstanding, is involved. Yeah, if he wants me to get into that question, he can feel free to ask. But for now, I'll kind of leave it at that. Because, again, I'm assuming he's asking tariffs in general. Let's see. In your opinion, will the wall be built or not? I actually think it will be. Because I don't think it's a big ask. It's only really $5 billion is not a whole lot in the compared to the total value of the U.S. government's budget every year. So $5 billion to kind of appease a restive and upset, a substantively large restive and upset part of the U.S. electorate. That's not a real deep price to pay, really. I know a lot of people don't like it because they see it as a symbol of, what they perceive to be the administration's racism or etc. or just in general anti-immigration politics. Symbolic, basically. They see it as a symbol of this, that, or the other policy or politics that they disagree with. But beyond that, just in terms of absolute value, it's not that much. $5 billion is pretty doable. Is the wall going to be effective? Probably not by itself. It would probably be better to focus on general border security that involves not only infrastructure on the border, but also a lot of what you would, I guess, social capital, other thing, software, human capital, things like that, technology, working with the Mexican government and, having them implement certain policies and cooperating with them. There's a whole spectrum of stuff you could do to help secure a border beyond just a wall. But given that the focus is on a wall, yeah, it probably will get built in some form or fashion eventually. It's just not, it's just too doable, basically. If they were asking to, go to the moon, build a wall on the moon, that's not very feasible. That's super expensive. It doesn't really mean anything. But in contrast, building a wall on the border, it's kind of a symbolic thing for them, for the people who want it, more so than about it being effective.
And we've talked about this in a few other segments. We already have a border fence that went up during George W. Bush's presidency. So
yeah, it wasn't constructed all along the border, though. I think that kind of what is part of what gets. There are certain areas that are still, I guess, vulnerable is the word you would use.
Those areas are also really, really treacherous to pass through as a person on foot. So there are quite a few documentaries on what the border fence is like. Now, a lot of people don't even know that exists. And one of the workarounds for this fence are to go underneath it. And I don't know if you know about the difference between a wall and a fence. And we've talked about this a little bit in terms of, I think Israel does something like this where they have not only just a above ground way of managing it, but also below ground, kind of detecting if there are tunnels being made in a given area. It ends up being pretty silly if you think about it, in the context of the kind of Mexican-American migration patterns and workers who come across and things like that. But yeah, there's history to this that not a lot of people know about.
Yeah, the border, there have been actions taken at the border. There is infrastructure there, etc. And it's not hard to get around a wall, like you say. I mean, if you do build the wall, Trump's wall on the border with Mexico, it's probably not going to have a big impact on the degree of illegal immigration from Mexico into the U.S. or from Central America into the U.S. But again, it is, I think, mostly symbolic. And I think we've talked a bit about that before, how a lot of the support for Trump isn't so much about actually securing the border per se. It's more about showing that the government will respond to the will of the public, because there is a substantive, and has been, a substantive desire on a big chunk of the voting electorate to do more on the border, but there's a sense that the government has kind of used them. That successive governments have promised to do something about border security, but then kind of did not prioritize it, didn't really do anything about it. So part of building the wall is not just improving security, it's about establishing that, yes, the government is responsive to the electorate, which is something that is kind of in doubt for a big chunk of the American electorate at this point. And not only people on the right, for that matter. People on the left, I don't think, want a wall, but they do want things too, kind of in that vein. So yeah, I do think it'll be built eventually. In some I think Trump himself has kind of walked it back a little bit. He says that there are some parts of the border where there are quote-unquote natural obstacles. So like I assume rivers, mountains, things like that. So it's probably not going to be a wall all along the border. But he'll build enough of a wall to be able to say to his base that, yes, I delivered on this promise. And if they're happy with that, then that's kind of what the important thing is. Having a public be satisfied with its government is probably the most important thing that can come out of policy beyond actually being effective, next to actually being effective.
Sounds funny when you say it that way.
Well, I mean, that's a lot of what liberal democracy is about, maintaining the public's trust in the government. Hypothetically, we could have an authoritarian government that just always does things in the optimal way, however you want to define optimal. But with a liberal democracy, there's a lot of hoops and dances and voodoo ceremony stuff that the government does specifically in order to try to appease public distrust and maintain public trust in institutions. And that's part of what makes liberal democracies stronger in the long run over authoritarian government. That there is that public buy-in into the government as a fair and equitable arbiter between actors within society and as a representative of the public will. It sounds corny, but it actually means quite a bit. You don't have to look hard in history to see examples of states that have lost legitimacy, that just are not on good terms with their public and have that manifest in very negative ways for the society. So yes, the wall will not be effective, I don't think. That's my prediction, but it will serve its main purpose of showing that the government is responsive to the part of the public that wants it. And so in so much as it serves its purpose of appeasing them, it would be useful. And given that $5 billion is not that much, it'll probably get built for that reason. I'm not saying I want it or don't want it. I'm not on here to proselytize people. That's not my bag. I'm just saying that's my prediction. That's what I think it's going to be for, and that's why I think it's going to be built. And as for the Democrats, I think they'll eventually just negotiate it, because again, they'll get something in return for it. There's already been some horse trading. I know there was already technically an agreement in place, and then Trump kind of pulled out of that agreement because he got pressure from his base that it didn't involve funding for the wall. So they'll probably go back to that. They'll probably have some funding for the wall, or there'll be preliminary funding. I suspect there might be something like that where they pretend to completely fund the wall, but they only authorize a small portion of it for the following year so that they can do preliminary work. And then the year after that, they maybe do the same thing again. So technically, Trump could say in that case that the wall has been quote-unquote funded, but then the Democrats can say that nothing is actually going to be done about it, and that when Trump is voted out, that they'll just take all the money back anyway. Because that's what the Democrats will say. They'll say that he's going to lose 2020, etc., etc. So everybody gets something that they want, and then everybody pretends that they kind of beat the other guy, which is kind of the style of politics that's kind of dominates these days.
Yeah, I totally beat that guy. Did you see that? It was amazing.
Well, that's very much been the Trump administration's strategy. You see that a lot with the free trade negotiations that he's been doing. There's a big hue and cry about unfairness and how the United States is being abused and how the trade agreements need to be revised, and then they go and do the negotiation, and it's like very superficial stuff that they actually change. It's generally not that substantive. In fact, with the NAFTA renegotiation, most of the changes were stuff that people who were pro-NAFTA had been asking for. It wasn't really a substantive rejigging of the agreement to try to return manufacturing to the U.S. There were some concessions made in that vein, but they weren't really all that substantive. I don't think they're going to be very effective. But as a PR exercise, it apparently was very successful. You know, I mean, his supporters seemed to like it. Again, that's the important thing. Is the base satisfied? Are the voters satisfied? And so long as that's the case, it's technically a win. And since the business was not particularly harmed by the changes, they also called it a win. They've been really worried that it would be a lot more dramatic than it was. So they were pretty happy with the changes. Let's see, so then, oh, right. What do you think the lasting implications of the shutdown? Do you think the exploitation of the National Emergency Act will have major implications? I don't think the shutdown will have lasting implications. I mean, the government is an important part of the the government is an important part of the economy in the U.S., but it's not as important as in a lot of other developed countries. So, I think the prediction I saw is that it'll knock off maybe something like 0.1 or 0.2% of annual growth from the year's GDP, which is not all that much. It's pretty manageable. I don't think there will be lasting implications in that sense. There might be some lasting implications on a personal level. I'm sure there's any number of people who have been personally negatively impacted by it, but just in terms of the overall society and economy, the implications probably won't be long term. I would not expect as much. I guess you can make a political argument about maybe shutdowns being institutionalized as a legitimate tactic, but I don't think that's true either. You know, I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful that this is kind of a stage that U.S. politics is going through, and that eventually we're kind of going to mature out of it and reach a stage where politics is settled in a more civil fashion, you know, less confrontational, more like what it used to be. Although it used to be pretty confrontational too, just in a kind of different, better managed way, I would argue.
Well, we talked before about the difference in valuing skepticism and compromise versus the strength of your convictions, and we're kind of in a strength of your convictions phase,
yeah,
culturally speaking, where to compromise and to agree that, well, maybe we can meet in the middle would be a sign of weakness rather than one of wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very much the broad perception. And I think we've, you know, kind of like what we've talked about before, I think some of that is just because that there's so many more people dialed into politics than there used to be. You know, there's so much more information because of technology and social media and the internet now that it's easier to kind of get dialed in. But a lot of people, you know, I think having such a large proportion of the polity involved in politics is kind of new. And a lot of people are still kind of learning how to handle it. Or more accurately, we as a society are still learning how to handle that. So I think once some of the democratic norms that used to govern political relations between politicians and political elites starts to water down into the broader politic, then we'll start to see some progress. But I think for now, we're still kind of in that learning stage, early learning curve, so to speak. That's the ideal anyway. Obviously, it could just veer off into a disaster, but who's to say? But kind of that's where I roughly think we are anyway. Do I think the exploitation of the National Emergency Act will have major implications?
What is that?
The National Emergency Act. I'm not sure exactly what that refers to specifically. I had not thought that a specific act was the power that he would use. At least that's not what I remember reading. I can actually post that article. Maybe I can, just to give people a reference. Let me see if I can find the address. There it is. So I'll post this in Discord here, and who did we have today?
Fuzzy Cord.
Fuzzy Cord, if you would be so kind as to pass that, oh god, pass this along to chat. Oh, that's not gonna work. Oh, Discord is doing a thing at me.
Oh boy.
Oh, it's because it's, alright. It's in Excel, so it's a JPEG. There we go. So I hadn't thought it was a particular act that he would use. Oh, thank you, Mass Neotech. So I hadn't thought it was a particular act. But regardless, just using that power like that, it's a bad precedent, because even if it's technically legal, it kind of breaks with democratic norms. In any democratic society, you can only, how should I put this? There's only so much rules can do to maintain a democratic society. You can pass lots of laws, you can create oversight, there's lots of things you can do to try to prevent, corruption and abuses of power, but ultimately, there's always going to be a way to get around those if you look hard enough and if there's enough political will, and certainly if there's enough political support. So ultimately, the only way to maintain a democratic society over the long run, and I should specify liberal democratic society, liberal in the classical sense, classical liberalism, the only way to maintain a liberal democracy over the long term is through democratic norms. That is to say, a kind of political culture of forbearance, where everybody understands it's in their best interest not to try to get away with everything they can, to try to operate within certain bounds voluntarily without anyone having to force you to, out of respect for the limitations of democracy as a political system, out of a desire to try to maintain the good faith of your political opponents, and out of a desire to try to maintain the overall stability of the system and the trust of the public, of the electorate. Democratic norms, again, kind of sound hokey and stupid, but they're really important. It's really important to the functioning of any democratic society that norms, informal norms, if not formal norms as well, are respected by major political actors. Because once they start to break those, then the whole system will start to fray. And at that point, it really doesn't matter how strong your institutions are. Eventually, they're going to collapse. There's not really much you can do about that. And that's why the current political era that not only the United States, but the rest of the developed world is in is kind of disturbing, because it does seem like some of those democratic norms are being challenged. Now, whether or not that's a systematic thing, a secular trend that's going to continue on, or whether that's a temporary thing, more a sign of the times than it is a sign of a permanent change, that's what's unclear at this point. And that's kind of why it's important that democratic norms be upheld as much as they can anyway. Obviously, democratic norms, more than anything, require trust amongst different groups in a society, and that's another big problem, is that without mutual trust between major political factions, it's very difficult to reach a consensus. And a consensus is the ideal in any democratic society. So how to kind of deal with that is unclear. In the United States case, the country is so big that the answer will probably involve a lot of decentralization, giving more power to lower levels of government, because generally lower levels of government are more homogenous and it's easier to reach a consensus. Much easier than at the federal level, where you're basically having to negotiate between 300 million people. But it's a problem everywhere, and even at a local level, you have examples like cities, which are very large but also very diverse and have lots of different groups, and that's very difficult to navigate as well. And that's not really clear how you can kind of undo partisanship in examples like that. So, well, that's very much an open question right now, not only for the U.S., but liberal democracy in general. Kind of something to keep your eye on. Not sure how I got onto that, actually. I was answering a question of some kind. Oh, National Emergency Act. So yeah, that's why if the Trump administration does declare a national emergency, that it would not bode well over the long term. It does kind of set a bad precedent, just in the sense of kind of breaking with democratic norms in that sense. So I wouldn't really like it for that reason. But given the lack of trust, I can certainly see how it would come about, but it's still not really a good sign. That's not a good indicator.
Just another one of those meandering answers.
Yeah, sorry.
No, those are fun. That's what this segment is for.
Meandering John Smith. Let's see. So in American politics, most politicians only ever speak of the middle class and its woes, entirely ignoring the existence of the poor and working class. Do you think this is quiet erasure is intentional molding of the narrative or ignorance or what? Excuse me, getting some water. I think in the case of the U.S., the problem is that nobody's working class or poor, and the reason, well, I should specify, nobody thinks of themselves as working class or poor, or at least the vast majority of people do. The United States does have poor and it does have a working class, but most of them identify as middle class.
We have two kinds of people. We have millionaires and temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of the old saying here. Yeah, so I think that's the more relevant issue there. You know, I think politicians only ever speak to the middle class because that's how people identify themselves. They think of themselves as middle class. If somebody went out and said, I'm going to speak for the working class poor, and I'm going to fight for their rights, then a lot of people who are working class poor but don't think of themselves as such would kind of be turned off by that. They don't really, you know, they don't really click with that kind of rhetoric. It doesn't do anything for them, really. That's a very American culture. That's very much American culture at work there. That's just sort of the Anglo-Saxon influence, which is very much one of independence and self-sufficiency. And there's kind of a cultural aversion to government assistance in Anglo-Saxon societies, especially the U.S. And so that makes that kind of rhetoric sort of unattractive. You know, there are people who are receptive to it, and it does happen to a degree in certain places, but in general, U.S. culture is still at a spot where it's not the mainstream, at least not yet. I don't know if it ever will be, but it's possible. But for now, not quite. So I think that's the principal reason why politicians do that. That's just good politics. It's good strategy. You know, you're not going to, if you're going to try to communicate with people and get their votes, you want to try to do it in a way that appeals to their self-image, to their identity. You're not going to go out and try to proselytize and impose an identity on them. You know, that's you can try, but it's probably not going to be a vote winner. That's probably going to cause more arguments than donations. Let's see. What has been the result of the policy change regarding net neutrality? I don't think anything's resulted from it yet, because I don't think it's been implemented yet, has it?
I think it's kind of a ongoing battle.
Well, the rule change went through. You know, they officially did make the change, but I think there was a delay in when it would take place. I don't think it's technically taken place. Not sure. June 11th? Nah. Yeah, I'd have to go back and read more about it. It's been a while since I read about it. I mean, if it did get implemented, then it hasn't been noticeable. And I haven't noticed any significant change on my end. You know, have you, Neuro?
No, there was one, this is not related to it, but it's the thing that kind of popped in my head in a similar capacity that concerns us. In the EU, there's some article that's being put up that would affect a lot of people who create content like I do in Europe, or if you're watching from Europe. It would create a lot of barriers and restrictions. You would have to get a lot of permission and demonstrate you own the rights to what you're doing and all this, which would be a really big hit to the economy of live streaming and YouTubing from Europe or watching that kind of content. Maybe some viewers know more about the current details on that, but Twitch has been talking to us directly. Like the CEO sent out a message to everyone saying that this matters, and talk to your Congress people and whatever if you're a European viewer or streamer.
I actually know more about that. I actually have some notes on that.
Oh.
But the net neutrality thing I haven't heard much about. That's been very much under the radar. So yeah, I'll try to read more about that, and I might have something for you next week or whenever we're next on here. Net neutrality. Open up a tab, so don't forget. But yeah, on the other thing, that's Articles 11 and 13, and don't ask me what the law is because I don't remember it, but the specific articles in question are 11 and 13, and the one you're referring to I think is 11, because that's the one that restricts, well basically it requires that websites that have forums and, you know, places for people to post content, they have to police that content to make sure there's nothing that violates copyright.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to necessitate the imposition of content filters. Either that, or they just remove the forums entirely, because content filters are expensive. So that's kind of what the controversy is about. You know, should websites be required to have, in effect, required to have content filters? And you know, even if they can't afford it, is it fair to the public? Is it fair to the public to have to deal with that? You know, is it fair to kind of impose that degree of intellectual property protections on the internet, which nominally is what the argument for it is about? So there was actually a vote in the, European Union Commission, I think, and it did not pass. And that does not mean that it failed. They're still going to negotiate it. But for now, it's going to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to have to redesign it because there was a lot of countries that were opposed to it. So I think there was, in my notes here, I have 6 countries objected to the proposed text. Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. I'm not sure what the other one was. But they were concerned about user rights specifically. So specifically concerned about, you know, those restrictions on the ability to post content and the intellectual property protections that were part of the article. And it's looking like there's not going to be another vote on it again until after European Union Parliament elections in a couple months. So you know, people who are worried about it are going to be good until then. And it was kind of surprising because I think it had been expected that the rule would kind of go through. Again, it still seems relatively likely, but the longer it gets kind of debated, the more resistance it seems to meet. So there is a growing chance that it'll be shot down entirely or significantly watered down. So, you know, if you're against it, there's hope in that regard. But I think some version of it probably will get passed eventually, because there is a fair amount of demand for enhanced intellectual property protections on the internet. It has been for some time. And there's definitely some major industries pushing for it. There's also some major industries that actually came out against it, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's, again, the more it gets talked about, the more exposure it gets, the more kind of resistance it generates. So there may well be a critical mass of political opposition that emerged to kind of destroy it. But for now, there was a temporary defeat, but it's still out there. So that's kind of the update on that. We'll see in a couple months where it goes. European Union elections will actually be interesting in their own right. There's a lot of concern that not just populist right-wing political parties, if not also populist left-wing parties, are going to do really well in the upcoming Parliament elections. So that could significantly impact EU decision-making going forward. Remains to be seen. The EU Parliament is not exactly a particularly strong institution, but how well those parties do in the election could be a signal of how much support parties like that in individual countries have. And it could kind of portend future political trends in Europe as a whole. So that's something else to watch. Why don't you think the Mueller investigation will go anywhere? Thus far, very many things alleged to have happened have been revealed to be true. For example, for all the buzz about the Steele dossier, several key claims have since been corroborated by numerous sources. So I don't think the Mueller investigation will go anywhere because nominally the focus of the Mueller investigation is collusion with Russia. And that's a very difficult thing to prove, because you're not just having to prove that the Trump administration, not the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, you know, you have to prove that Donald Trump and key members of his campaign explicitly cooperated with Russians to swing the election or to influence the election. And furthermore, you have to prove that they did it knowingly. And that's a really high bar. It's a very difficult thing to prove. And again, it's not exactly clear how you would go after a president if you did find that he was guilty of some kind of wrongdoing in that vein. So there are constitutional and legal problems there as well. So I don't think they'll find enough to really get key convictions as regards collusion specifically. They'll find lots of other stuff, I'm sure they already have. But, you know, that's no shock. If you look hard enough in any political campaign, you'll probably find lots of people with their hands dirty. So I'm not surprised that an investigation with the depth of the Mueller investigation is finding people like that. But whether or not they'll find the thing that they're really looking for, collusion, I don't think they're going to find any smoking gun or any such thing on that count. And even if they do, there's going to be a lot of politics and legal problems that'll fall out from that. So, you know, I don't think even in the dramatic case that they actually find some explicit collusion, that there will necessarily be impeachment that follows. There will certainly be a shitstorm in that case, but whether or not they'll actually result in the removal of Donald Trump is unclear. But I don't even think they'll get that far. I just don't think there will be enough evidence. So that's why I say I don't think it'll go anywhere. They may find a whole bunch of other shit. Again, they already kind of have, but the real question to me is whether or not they're going to get collusion, and I don't think so. I'm skeptical. Let me put it like that. I'm very skeptical. Let's see, how do you feel about the stability of the EU considering the whole Brexit situation? Pretty good, actually. I mean, just in terms of whether or not the EU will maintain its integrity going forward because of Brexit, then yes, I would be kind of bullish on that. And the reason is that the European Union is kind of going out of its way to make Brexit hard, specifically to serve as a disincentive for Eurosceptic political groups and, if not Eurosceptic countries, to kind of try to disincentivize leaving the European Union, to make it look very costly, to make it look very unappealing. And that was inevitable. They kind of had to do that because there was already a lot of Eurosceptic sentiment and a lot of anti-European Union sentiment that kind of came out of the Eurozone crisis, which happened, some years previous to the Brexit vote. So there was kind of a sense that the European Union was really getting fundamentally challenged, and in that the European Union had to kind of take a stand. They did that with the Eurozone crisis when they kind of refused to allow Greece to just write off its debt. That's pretty much the main reason they did that, specifically to try to prevent other countries from defaulting and the thinking that they could get bailed out by the EU. They were willing to bite the bullet on that, and I think they're going to do the same here. I think they would prefer to maintain good and close economic ties with the UK, but I think they're willing to sacrifice that in order to try to create a barrier for anyone who kind of wants to break up the EU or really challenge it in that way. So I think that they're kind of succeeding in doing that. I don't think anybody looks at Brexit as any kind of ideal that they would want to go through, even if it was just a bluff. I don't think anybody looks at that as a good experience. So the European Union probably looks on that as a successful display of maintaining the European Union's integrity in the future. It's not pretty, but I think it's working in that sense. Actually, there's been some traction on the Brexit issue too over the past while. I could talk about that real quick. I think last time on Brexit drama, I think we were talking about how Theresa May's deal was coming up for a vote, and that vote came and it failed, which is pretty much what everybody predicted. I think I predicted that she would kind of bring together and it would pass, so I was wrong on that. It did actually fail, but after that, a lot of different groups in Parliament tried to come forward and pass votes to kind of steer the government and what kind of Brexit it should try to negotiate, and pretty much all of those votes failed as well. So the whole Brexit process kind of became rudderless at that point. I think there were only 2 resolutions that did pass, and they were very sort of weak. They were not binding, and they were just sort of very ambiguously worded, so they didn't really mean much. They were in support of May's deal, and they kind of did give her some political capital to go back to the European Union and say, look, you need to give me some concessions so I can break this deadlock in Parliament. To which the European Union just kind of laughed because they don't want to do that. Again, the European Union's whole position is not how do we maintain good relations with Britain. Their whole position is how do we try to make sure that nobody sees Brexit as being a really good, viable strategy. Or more accurately, leaving the European Union as being a good, viable strategy. So they don't really want to budge. And so that kind of puts the UK in a tough spot. So it's probably going to fall on political factions in Parliament to try to unwind all that. I think they are kind of congealing around what they're calling, I'm going to mispronounce this. I think it's called the Malthouse Agreement. Amendment, maybe. I'm not sure if it's Malthouse or Malthouse. I'm sure somebody British listening can correct me on that. But basically, the agreement, what it entails is the UK, well, for one, they would get rid of the backstop agreement entirely. And instead of a backstop agreement, there would be an additional year of Brexit transition. And if you don't know what Brexit transition is, technically, what they've agreed to in Theresa May's deal is that after the UK leaves the European Union in March, I think it is going to be next month or so, after that, there's going to be 2 years where the UK will not be in the European Union, but where it will still have access to the European Union single market. In effect, it will de facto still be part of the EU, but it won't have any voting rights. And during that 2-year period, the UK and the European Union will actually have negotiations on what their actual future economic relationship will be, basically the actual Brexit agreement. The reason that was thought necessary is because it wasn't thought that there was really enough time after the Brexit negotiations had been going on for some time to really come to a full Brexit agreement before the March deadline of this year. So Brexit transition was thought to be necessary. And so that's actually a core part of Theresa May's deal and will probably be a part of any deal at this point. So in a way, it's actually kind of goofy. The main problem right now in terms of the Brexit negotiations is not the transition period or the actual economic relationship or anything like that. It's actually the backstop, which is kind of an emergency backup agreement that will probably not even end up getting used. But people are arguing about it because they're worried that it's going to end up being the de facto final agreement. Because if nobody comes to an agreement, then that's the default. So that kind of gives the European Union a little bit of leverage, in so much as it is kind of favorable to the European Union. So there's a lot of politics around that are kind of gumming up the works of the Brexit negotiation. But the Malthouse Agreement would kind of just deal with that by getting rid of the backstop and adding another year to the transition period. And I think they also threw in more rights for Europeans in the UK. I think that was something else they have in the agreement. They might have added more to it since I last read about it, but that's where it was when I was reading it. So that could be something that the European Union could agree to, but it's not really clear at this point. They really do like that backstop agreement because they worry a lot about the Irish border issue, and that's really something they're pushing hard on. They want to make sure that the British cannot somehow weasel out of an Irish border agreement or something to that effect. They really want that emergency backstop as insurance to make sure that a border does not return between Ireland and Northern Ireland. What I read is that the European Union might be more willing to compromise. One, if the UK could actually, the Parliament could actually vote on a resolution that gives Theresa May a lot of support behind a specific agreement instead of just sort of vaguely defined resolutions that don't really show any actual consensus. So consensus in Parliament would be a significant improvement for the UK's bargaining leverage. That could shift the European Union. And then also, if the deadline is imminent and there's still no agreement, that could also possibly shift them. So I don't think any consensus is going to emerge in Parliament anytime soon. Maybe I'm wrong on that. If we've got some British people listening, they can kind of chime in. But I'm skeptical on that count. So maybe Theresa May's only card to play at this point is to basically play chicken with the EU and just try to keep negotiating until the last minute and hope the EU gives her enough of a concession to in turn go back to the Parliament and get enough votes to finally get her damn deal passed. And then Brexit will be over, finally. Kind of. Not really. Well, after if they do manage to work this out and there is an agreement passed, then comes the next stage of Brexit, which is the trade negotiations, where the European Union and the UK in the transition period negotiate some kind of free trade deal to replace the European Union single market access. And that's going to be a huge shit show in its own right. It may not be as dramatic as the Brexit negotiations have been, but that's going to drag out for a while, and it'll probably be just as contentious.
So what really did we learn? Don't do referendums. It's just bad. Just because you think you know what's going to happen doesn't mean that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it does not reflect well on referenda as a decision-making device. If most of your population supports a given result, you don't need a referenda in the first place, because then you can just do it. But if your population is divided like 50-50, then if you hold a referendum, it doesn't matter what you do afterwards. Half the country is going to be wicked pissed no matter what. So it's not really a good way to break a deadlock. We were talking about democratic norms before. if you don't have enough of a consensus to push forward, or at least a substantive enough majority to push forward with a given policy or legislation, it's kind of better to use forbearance and take a step back and either try to reach a compromise agreement or to just let it go. One or the other. It's generally not good to impose legislation on people. We've certainly seen plenty of that, over the past, in the US here, the past couple decades, and it upsets people quite a bit. It's not really healthy for the electorate. So, not really good politics. We've talked about before how David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, when he was running for election before Brexit, he promised a Brexit referendum basically as a way to kind of get the Eurosceptic vote, because there's always been a lot of people in the Tories who don't like the fact that the UK is in the European Union. They've been bitching about it pretty much constantly ever since the UK joined up. And they've always been pushing the party kind of to try to get out of the EU or have a referendum or something. So he offered that as a concession, thinking that there was no way that people would actually vote to leave the European Union. And then they did. So that kind of blew up in his face a bit. Now, I don't know that for sure that he did that, but that is kind of my suspicion. Kind of think I've read that other people kind of think that as well. They were certainly surprised after the fact. That's some corroborating evidence. Anyway, that's kind of where Brexit is right now. Something to keep your eye on.
TLDR, it's a mess. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see. There's probably going to be a lot of movement at the last minute once we hit March. I suspect that's more the direction that's going to go, because I don't really know that Theresa May has a lot of other options at this point. So, see you in March. Good luck. Let's see. How are transgender issues working out politics-wise? I heard about a memo saying Trump wanted to erase the transgender person by wording that they can't exist or so. I don't think that's what that was, actually. First of all, I have no idea. That's the real answer to this question, because I don't follow that issue very closely. So, that said, what you're referring to is a memo, I think, about the military. I hope I'm remembering that. I'm sure somebody in chat knows more about it than I do, and I would encourage them to kind of chip in here and keep me honest. But I think it was a military memo that kind of regarded a policy that the Trump administration passed, I think, last year that prevented people who were transgender from joining the military. I think that's what it was. Because the Obama administration had made a big change and kind of explicitly allowed it. It had been I think the rules had been kind of fuzzy before. And then the Obama administration made it explicitly legal. And then the Trump administration has been trying to kind of undo that decision. So I don't think they said that transgender people can't exist. I think they're just saying that they can't join the military. I think there was some specific legal phrasing that sounded like they can't exist, but I think that ended up kind of being blew up by politics, basically. Again, this is me remembering a very fuzzy memory. I'm not explicitly sure that's what it was, but I think I do remember it was something to that effect. Again, I hope somebody in chat is kind of cleaning this up for me. But that's what I remember. Let's see. What are your thoughts regarding Venezuela's situation? Is it all about the oil? It's about the oil and the price controls. That's what really did them in. Price controls and low oil prices pretty much wrecked the economy there. It was always a bad combo. Ecuador and Bolivia, well, Ecuador specifically, exports a lot of oil and has a Chavista government, or at least had one, and their economy did not collapse. So obviously Venezuela was doing something different. I suspect the thing they were doing different was gross incompetence and negligence, if not corruption as well. Well, I mean, it's possible to have a socialist government without just completely running the country into the ground. It can be done. But the Venezuelan government does not really seem to have been able to quite pull that off. So, yeah, they wrecked the economy with a lot of bad policy, bad oil management, and just general corruption.
We've talked about that in past episodes, about the difference between whether a strategy is viable versus the execution of said strategy. And how you could have a a more free market system or a more socialist system, and the execution matters a whole bunch for the success and the prosperity of the populace. It's not just like every country should be out and try to find the most optimal system, because that's partially related to the cultural norms and what makes sense to the population, whether they're individualists or collectivists and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're basically saying that their execution was just not there, and things are bad because of it.
It really wasn't. It really wasn't. Yeah, just about everything that they could do wrong, they pretty much did do. So that's more the problem there. This person might also be asking more specifically about recent events. And the recent event is that, now let me see if I want to make sure I try to get this right. There's a guy named, I can't even pronounce it, Guadeo? Something that sounds like, I hope we have some Venezuelans listening who can kind of correct me on that as well. But basically there was a politician in the parliament, well not parliament, the National Assembly, who was voted president by the National Assembly. And that was a big deal, because that was the most explicit move that the National Assembly has made yet to challenge the authority of President Maduro. Now, the Maduro administration basically shrugged it off, because the National Assembly doesn't really have any power at this point. Because what happened was, I think a year ago, 2 years ago, it's actually, yeah, maybe about 2 years ago, there was a constituent assembly that was voted in. And that's basically a constitutional convention. You know, so they had an assembly that was convened to negotiate and vote on a new constitution for Venezuela. And that constituent assembly was given powers that superseded the National Assembly, the actual legislature. And they kind of voted themselves more and more power over time, and voted powers away from the National Assembly, basically defanging it almost completely. So the National Assembly doesn't really matter at this point. But in order to pressure the Maduro government, the National Assembly, which still technically does exist, voted one of its number president. You know, they basically cited a rule about, some obscure rule about presidential corruption or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. But they voted out Maduro and voted in this guy. So now he's claiming to be the legitimate president of Venezuela, and that Maduro is illegitimate, and that Venezuela's government and various government institutions should declare loyalty for him, so that they can get rid of Maduro and his people. So that's been the big new thing the past couple weeks. And the U.S. has kind of been throwing its weight behind the hell is his name? That's going to drive me crazy. Venezuela. Guaido? I'm looking at it and I still can't pronounce it. But that guy has been getting support from the United States, and I think Europe as well, and I think Colombia and certain other Western aligned countries in Latin America. They're kind of throwing their weight behind them, but I don't think they're really going to do anything substantive. And I think the reason is that the Maduro government still has a substantial amount of support amongst the public. There's still a lot of people who are hardcore Chavistas, who claim to be better off now than they were before. You know, even as bad as things have gotten, there are still people in Venezuela who were very poor before Chavism, I guess, took power in Venezuela, and those people don't want to kind of give that up. You know, they feel that however bad things are in Venezuela, it would be worse for them if the Chavistas were pushed out of power. So there's a good chunk of the public that still supports the Chavista government for that reason, and that's in addition to the people who support the government because they think they have to. You know, one of the things that the government did is start giving out rations, and they started distributing through these local committees that are basically controlled by the ruling party, as well as the military, I think, which is itself, of course, controlled by Maduro and his people. So if you're kind of dependent on those rations, it doesn't really behoove you to challenge the government, because they could very easily take them away. So there are people who kind of support the government out of necessity as well. So combined, those two factions of Venezuela's constituency are kind of enough to give the Venezuelan government enough legitimacy within Venezuela to kind of forestall any kind of general uprising. And they've also done a pretty good job of capturing key institutions like the military and police. You know, a lot of the higher-ranking officers are political appointees, or, you know, maybe more accurately, were appointed because they were willing to be politically loyal. So they get lots of goodies. They've been assigning them to non-military posts as well. So there's a number of officers who are in charge of economic posts in the government, which is not something that had been done previously. But that basically gives them a way to kind of siphon funds from that post. If you want somebody to be loyal to you, part of the deal is that they can basically steal money. They can kind of abuse their power in a given post to get more money than they would otherwise get paid. And so the government kind of turns a blind eye to that as a kind of quid pro quo. You support us and we look the other way, and you can kind of do that. So there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of kind of quid pro quo corruption and etc. that ensures that key officers in the military are going to be loyal to the regime, so to speak, the Maduro government. So for that reason, the military probably won't flip. You might see some lower level officers flip. You might see some of the, maybe some non-coms or something, but beyond that, it's probably not going to happen. So the odds are definitely stacked against the new guy, the National Assembly candidate and the National Assembly government, such as it is. I don't think they're going to get enough institutional support from government institutions to really turn the tables on Maduro. I think the most that can happen is that sanctions kind of come into play, because the U.S. finally did put sanctions on the Venezuelan state-owned oil company, and that's a big deal, because they were already hurting because of mismanagement in their oil industry. They nationalized the oil industry, and they've been bleeding it dry, to try to prop up their patronage network. And that, combined with an inability to kind of provide the kind of maintenance and technological expertise to really maintain production, has led oil revenues to really fall significantly. And so throwing sanctions on top of that is really going to hurt them. That's really going to sting. And that was kind of the big nuclear option for the U.S. government. They'd kind of been staying away because they didn't really want to get too involved, because they didn't want the opposition in Venezuela to be seen as a puppet of the U.S. If the U.S. really explicitly supports the opposition and starts throwing out sanctions against Maduro's government, then it really looks like we're trying to overthrow the government, and it's not a good look in Latin America, especially. So that was actually one of the reasons I was kind of critical of the Trump administration doing that. They're kind of playing into Maduro's hands a little bit. If their strategy is to try to prop up this National Assembly president and to try to build international pressure on the Maduro government, I don't think it's a good strategy. The international pressure will be substantive. That'll bring a lot of, that'll be probably pretty effective in maybe getting some concession. But if they think that the National Assembly and Maduro opponents in Venezuela are going to be enough by themselves, in conjunction with the sanctions, to overthrow the government, I really don't think it will be. Very skeptical. I think it's a very risky strategy, and I kind of suspect that some of the bigger hawks in the administration kind of orchestrated that. I don't know what they think is going to happen, but it's probably not very realistic.
Oh, we just got a nice host from Coltarin. Welcome. This is a live broadcast with a real person. This is not a podcast, at least not yet. It's interactive, so if you have any questions, we're talking about current events, foreign policy, economics, world history, anything like that. Feel free to just drop a line in the chat. It'll get passed along, and you can be part of this discussion. And I'm playing some StarCraft. What's up? As you were, Agent Smith.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. So yeah, that's just kind of a quick read on Venezuela. I'm pretty skeptical that he'll be gone. Maduro will probably stick around. He's got enough support from the people he needs support from, both among the general public and major institutions, to kind of stick around. It'll get a lot harder going forward with the oil sanctions in place, but I don't think the political opponents he faces in Venezuela are going to be nearly powerful enough to force the issue. But I could be wrong. Who's to say? Maybe the Trump administration has something up their sleeve they're going to try. I would be very wary about direct intervention, though. That's going to be a non-starter for pretty much all of Latin America. There's a lot of Latin American countries that'll provide diplomatic support to the U.S. in terms of pressuring Venezuela, but I don't think anybody is going to like direct intervention. That's a big red line for most of Latin America, even the parts of Latin America that are very much aligned to the U.S. Let's see. You said you thought the Mueller investigation would be much like the Kavanaugh hearing, with ultimately no Big Bang ending, but the Kavanaugh investigation was both limited in duration and scope by the White House. Do you think the Mueller investigation will be similarly limited? No, I don't think it'll be similarly limited like that. I think they will have a lot more room, and have gotten a lot more, to kind of explore and try to flesh out the investigation. the analogy is not perfect in that sense. I don't think it's going to be cut short in that way. The analogy I'm making there is just explicitly that the ending will be the same. I think there will be basically the same non-conclusive findings. So and that's more what I was kind of going for in that. Do you know of any substantial push for a move away from the Electoral College and first-past-the-post voting system to more modern voting system that encourages multiple parties candidates? I'm assuming this person is referring to the United States.
Yeah, we've talked about this before. One of the things is the Electoral College is supposed to protect the government from the tyranny of the masses. So if people aren't really well informed, you don't want them to have tons of power. You want them to have a say, but you want the experts to have more of a say than the non-experts generally, because they know more about how the system works. So that's kind of why the Electoral College is in place. It does seem unfair in the capacity of, well, we had more votes, why didn't we win? On paper, it has some advantages, and like we were saying before about the execution of a system versus the most ideal system, it's tough to say that this is the best system or that there are better systems. We've talked about other countries that have the problem of having too many political parties, that none of them have enough power to pull proper weight.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, for example, I suspect that we would probably still have a Trump government, even if we had like a proportional representative system. Because one of the reasons that Trump got into power is because people on the far left either abstained from voting or voted for alternative candidates. So in a multi-party system, in a proportional representative system, I suspect there would have been a far left party, a center left party, a center right party, and then a far right party, at least, if not more. And after the election happened, probably the way political tensions would manifest in that case is that the far left party would not have entered a coalition with the center left party because of differences over governance and policy, in which case you end up with a minority government, which is basically what we have now. It is quite possible to have a minority government in a parliamentary system, in a system like that, basically. Canada had a minority government for a long time under a guy named Harper in the sort of mid-aughts period. And I think there was another example in Belgium. Maybe that was just dysfunction. They just didn't have one for a long time in Belgium, I think. But the point is, that's not necessarily going to solve the problems that people have with the electoral system. You're not necessarily going to end up with results that are contrary to the results we're getting now. Fundamentally, there are certain political forces and tensions in the system that are going to manifest regardless of what kind of electoral system you have. You can change the system and maybe move the needle a little bit, but in so much as fundamental drivers are driving outcomes, you're probably not going to change those. Again, I'm open to criticism on that. I haven't studied electoral systems in great depth. And certainly it may be that changing the electoral system is a laudable goal in and of itself, beyond just changing the outcomes of elections. So that's all down to kind of personal opinion and whatnot. But yeah, well, to answer the question specifically, I do not know of any substantial push in that vein. I don't know of any big push to change the U.S. electoral system or first-past-the-post voting. It would be tricky to do because it would have to be done at the state level. Because you could actually have a state vote to change the way that it elects representatives to the at the federal level, to Congress. At the state level, there's hypothetically nothing stopping you from implementing a proportional representative system for selecting representatives in the House of Representatives, or, well, yeah, it would be the House of Representatives. Senate's different. That's a whole other ballgame. I think there actually was a ruling. I didn't follow this up. I've been meaning to for a while. One of the reasons that there has not been proportional representative systems is that there was actually a court case in the 60s, apparently, in which a state, I think, tried to do that, or the possibility was floated or something like that. And the courts actually shot it down on civil rights grounds because they were afraid that the South was going to, southern states specifically, were going to try to use that kind of system to try to disenfranchise and marginalize African-American voters. So there apparently is precedent against it on those grounds. But I didn't follow that up, so I don't really know the details. So that could be an institutional block in the U.S. Again, I'd have to read more about it. But I thought that was interesting. And it's kind of something to kind of people interested can kind of look up.
There is
But I don't.
one point that comes up a lot in discussion about American politics and how the country was founded, and how a lot of the, we call them founding fathers of the country, wanted things to be updated and changed in big ways over time, whereas a lot of them were basically just established as canon and they're fixed now, where they may have been really appropriate for early United States politics and governance and all that, whereas now in the information age and stuff, the voters are looking at politics in a very different way, like we discussed before, and representation should be a little bit different than it has been before. And we haven't really had that fast updating and constantly evolving government that I think they may have hoped for. And it's really hard to enact that kind of thing because a given body of people gets its own form of inertia. Like a person tends to want to remain in its current state and act as it does. And in the same way, a business or a government becomes self-interested and tries to maintain itself in a sort of selfish way where it tries to find more power for itself and more opportunity for itself. So it's definitely a tough beast to tackle. Yeah. And there were a lot of different opinions on it too. So you have to find such overwhelming consensus that you get an overhaul, which is a tall order.
Difficult in the best of times, even more difficult when your political system is riven by mistrust and political partisanship.
Yeah, we do not rate our legislature very well at all at this point.
Although, that's actually an interesting thing to bring up. Congress's approval ratings are very low, and I think I read somewhere some years ago that I think prostitutes were trusted more than congressmen in a survey. But at the same time, most people actually give their specific congressmen relatively high approval ratings.
I think part of that is the local congressperson often goes places and talks to where the public can go up and speak with them. So I have a personal anecdote with this. My parents live in Washington State in the Seattle area, which is very left-leaning. And I think it was either one of their representatives or their senators just came out to some town marketplace and was talking about current issues in the state and things they're trying to work on and all this. And charisma is a stat we talk about a lot, that basically what it means is when you're talking with someone, they tend to feel better about themselves and about the world and things like that, just as you're saying words, as opposed to feeling worse about it. And that kind of crosses party lines and it transcends ideology, where you can have a, quote, very good person who's very charismatic or a very evil person who is very charismatic. And that may fit in that criteria where your local politician is going outside and talking to people. They're probably pretty charismatic. So if people are listening to that, they tend to feel like, all right, I agree with a lot of this person's issues. They seem pretty smart. They seem to be trying their best. So I think my local politician is pretty good because I've heard what they have to say. But because someone's charismatic doesn't necessarily mean they're trustworthy. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to follow through on what they're saying. All it means is they're good at saying words at you and they make you feel good when you're listening to them. So it's a tricky business. It's kind of a necessary part of politics. Also show business, like being a streamer in the capacity of what I do. Charisma goes a really long way. Newscasters, all that. It's one of those stats that people should think about more. About, you have the policy of what someone's trying to go for, you have the integrity of their personal record, and you have their charisma over here, which can get the fire going and get you excited, but you should be able to connect all of these together before you support someone, rather than just go purely on their charisma.
Yeah. Yeah, building a rapport with your voters, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it means that you're building trust, which is a good thing. You know, it's important, again, that people have faith in their institutions and their representatives. But on the other hand, that trust can very easily be abused, you know, like you say. So unfortunately, that's something that all democracies face. That's a challenge that all democracies face. And that the voters kind of just have to navigate that as best they can. Ideally, there's a set of democratic norms that are recognized and adhered to kind of govern that. But those kind of vary from place to place, region to region, time period to time period. So you always end up with a lot of variance, especially in a place as big as the U.S. Let's see.
A bunch of people in the chat are all saying, I don't know if I can trust you now, Neuro. Are you lying to us? Are you evil? As a sort of aside, we get a lot of the categorization of good people and evil people, which is an oversimplification. Every day you have choices before you. Some of them are good choices, some of them are evil choices. And you have to earn goodness over time. It's not like you're a good person and you just have that card in your wallet and that's something you pull out and that's part of you forever. It's a daily struggle. Or if you're evil and you're trying to be the most evil person who ever lived, then you also have to be as evil as you can. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, good people can do evil things. Evil people can do good things. There's a whole spectrum there. Are we doing okay on time, or how are we doing on that?
Yeah, well, we started about 2 hours ago. I don't know how many questions we have backed up. I also try to factor in the energy of the person who's handing questions along. But I'm good to go for another hour at least.
Oh, okay. And we got a couple more questions, and I've got more notes to get through, so I'm good over here.
Light them up, dude.
Let's see, okay. What are the odds of Trump's re-election with the current Democratic runners? I think it's way too early to say. I think it's way too early, because it's, the Democrats are going to run a big field. There's going to be a lot of people running. It's going to be like back when, it was after Bush. What would it have been? 08, I think, the 2008 election. And I guess the 2012 election was the same way. The Republican race, for the Republican nomination was a total circus. There was just a whole ton of people running, and it didn't get whittled down until pretty late in the process. So I suspect that's going to be what the Democrats will be doing in 2020. So it's just way too early. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. It's going to be a horse race, let's put it like that. And it hasn't even really started yet. So until we kind of see what kind of candidate has support and what the general election strategy for the DNC is going to be for 2020, it's really hard to say how Trump will fare. And, there's also Trump himself and the Republican Party and their strategy and kind of what they do. Trump could well face a primary challenger. There could well be somebody that kind of challenges his claim to the nomination. Generally, it just pretty much goes by default to an incumbent president. But Trump, of course, is not exactly a normal president. So that could change. It's difficult to say. Again, very early going. Do you think a 28th Amendment restricting term limits for Congress would be advantageous for the U.S.? It could be. But I don't think it would really substantively impact politics and how politics is done in the U.S. And I would be skeptical on that count. And I think there's already term limits in place in individual states. I'd have to look them up. But I think I don't think there's anything stopping individual states from having such term limits. I think a number of them already have them. But I think in general, passing it at the federal level wouldn't really make much of a difference, regardless. On the one hand, you don't have politicians who just become career politicians who just stick around forever and kind of use their position as a piggy bank, just kind of raking in money. But on the other hand, if you're only there for a term or two, then, well, what happens when you're in your second term and you can't run again? You don't really have to give a shit. So you can kind of veer off and do whatever kind of crazy shit you want. So that's kind of the trade-off there. If you have a really good idealistic candidate, then he won't probably abuse his power, so to speak, if he's in that final term. But he could, hypothetically. It just kind of depends on the candidate and the voters and etc. But either way, I don't think it would make too big a difference. I don't think it really addresses the fundamental problems that are really plaguing the political system. But that said, I think it could be useful in so much as it would probably improve the public's trust in federal institutions. So in so much as it does that, it could well be worth doing. So that could be helpful. That could be advantageous. But I don't know that it would really fundamentally change the political calculus of how politics is done in Washington. I think that kind of reform would require much more far-reaching changes. Is it likely that an armed intervention will be required in Venezuela? I really don't think so. It would be a dumb idea because, again, the Venezuelan government would be able to marshal a big chunk of the population to fight back. And Venezuela is a pretty decent-sized country. It's got, 30, 40 million people in it? I think neither Iraq nor Afghanistan have had that many people. Iraq was something like 20 million while the United States was there. And even then, it wasn't any more than 20% of the population that was really insurgent, kind of helping the rebels. I guess some of the Shia were too. That was sort of the Mahdi army. So probably a bit more than that, but you would be facing a lot more people, a lot more rebels in Venezuela than either Afghanistan or Iraq. And the U.S. Army, the U.S. military was kind of barely able to keep the lid on those places. Venezuela would just be much harder. And again, I don't think the opposition is really organized enough to be a viable partner in doing that. I mean, and in any case, I don't think the government in Venezuela is really threatening enough to warrant U.S. intervention. I mean, you can point to, human rights violations and, the refugees and whatnot, but I don't, that's not really enough. That's not historically really been enough for the U.S. to intervene. Generally, there has to be some kind of strategic interest. And I don't think Washington is sufficiently threatened by Maduro and his government to really do something like that. I'm surprised they've done as much as they have. Recognizing the National Assembly president and, slapping the Venezuelan government with sanctions. That's, right there. That alone is more than I thought they'd ever do. It's the attitude of the U.S. for the hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, is you can ruin your country how you want. Just don't threaten American interests and don't invite an extra hemispheric power into the hemisphere. So long as neither of those conditions are met, the U.S. is kind of fine with it.
Monroe Doctrine.
Pretty much, yeah.
This is our half of the world. Heck off.
I know the Maduro government has kind of played footsie a bit with, Russia and China, but it hasn't really been anything substantive. In fact, I posted an article today on Twitter about that, talking about Russia dumping a lot of money into Venezuela and not having a lot to show for it, really. They've got some gold now, apparently. Apparently there's been a lot of gold that's been shipped out of Venezuela. To Russia in particular, but maybe to Turkey as well. But that's a temporary fix, I think they do have some gold production, but I don't think it's anything substantive. It's not going to be enough to float their budget, that's for sure. But yeah, I don't think that the degree to which Venezuela has engaged with Russia or China is enough to really be threatening as of yet. They're not talking about a military alliance or bases or anything like that. Thus far, they're kind of still within acceptable bounds. Mostly, it's just hostile rhetoric more than actual hostile actions. And so long as that's the case, we'll probably just treat them like Cuba. Just kind of contain them. Do you think the EU would tolerate not having a hard between Ireland and Ireland? Not having a hard border. That's what they do now, isn't it? Tolerating not having a hard border. As in tolerate having a soft border. Well, they already have a soft border, so I think maybe you mean would they tolerate having a hard... Correct me if I'm wrong, just feel free to, if I ever get your question wrong or, I misread it, because that's definitely happened before, please do feel free to clarify or elaborate, or if my answer isn't really satisfactory, please feel free to ask again, and I'm happy to return to it. But in this case, I think you mean would they tolerate a hard between Ireland and Ireland? I mean, if they had to, I think they would. But I mean, I think they've got enough leverage. I think they believe they have enough leverage to prevent the hard border from happening. They're really leaning hard on the UK to try to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think they can ensure it doesn't. If they had to, they would, but I don't think they have to, so I don't think they will. You know, there's just so much leverage on their side that it would be kind of hard for the UK to force it. And I don't think even the UK wants a hard border there. You know, that's, you know, how do you separate from the European Union and the single market without having a hard border with the European Union member state? That's been one of the big riddles in Brexit from the start. And that's kind of bedeviled negotiations from the start. They're still kind of trying to finagle that. But in general, neither party really wants it, and I think the EU really thinks they've got the leverage to force it. So I don't think it would happen. And that's it for questions. So let's see. I think what we talked about Syria, we got Brexit, talked about Afghanistan and the shutdown. So we didn't talk about China. The US-China trade negotiations are still kind of ongoing. And I think there's a March deadline for that. You know, they've started negotiations, I think the end of last year or early this year, and they've set a deadline of March to try to have some kind of final agreement. They probably won't have anything. I'm not optimistic in that sense. Because I still don't think, and we've talked about this a fair amount before, but I still don't think that the Chinese government is going to be willing to implement structural changes to their government, to their political system, that would be necessary in order to engender trust between the US government and the Chinese government, such that a trade agreement would be considered an acceptable compromise, such that any trade agreement could be reached that was able to defuse tensions. Because that's kind of more what the big issue is. You know, how much can you trust the Chinese government to kind of honor agreements that it won't steal intellectual property or force technology transfers or what have you? And even if it doesn't force those things, how can you trust it to prevent Chinese economic actors, be they influenced by the Chinese Party or Chinese Communist Party or not? Can you trust them to prevent those actors from doing it anyway? You know, and one of the problems is that China's market is so large that they kind of have a fair amount of leverage. You know, if you do want to do business there, they can kind of lean on you because they know how hard it is for foreigners to do business in China, just if only because of the cultural differences. You know, the language is different, business practices are different, business culture is different. The environment, the whole overarching commercial and regulatory apparatus is just wildly different from most other countries. You know, so that alone is a big barrier. And if you just add on top of that predatory firms that will really lean on you to give them concessions if you want to pair with them and partner with them, which you pretty much have to do, even without government pressure, that certainly is conducive to an uneven playing field. But you know, that the argument of to what degree China is an unequal playing field just because of natural economic and structural factors, as opposed to purposeful political policy-making decisions by the Chinese Communist Party, that's a tough debate, because China is not a transparent society, right? Well, more accurately, the government is not transparent.
Opaque.
So it's really hard. It's opaque, yeah. It's very opaque, so it's very hard to kind of answer that question. You know, because you kind of have to have some transparency to see what the government is doing, to see the extent to which the government is influencing economic actors. Because it's a one-party state, they can totally do that. You know, they can just use informal channels to subtly threaten you or intimidate you into doing what they want, if you are a Chinese firm. So they have methods of governing China that go beyond normal channels that you would see in a society that was more liberal democratic, where governance is more institutionalized, more formal in the way things work. And so in order for any agreement to really have weight, you kind of have to have some transparency. And I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is at all interested in transparency. So that right there is one of the biggest stumbling blocks in the trade negotiation. You know, hypothetically, they could agree to not force technology blah, 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 do all the stuff the U.S. wants, but there would be no way of knowing the extent to which they were really honoring that agreement without more transparency. So I really don't know how that trade negotiation can really end in anything but either disagreement and no trade agreement, or a bullshit agreement with just purely superficial concessions by both sides. I don't think it can really end in any other way. I mean, if it did end in substantive concessions by China, that would be surprising. It would be good. It would be good for all parties involved. But I think it extremely unlikely, because the party is just really not comfortable at all making what it would consider political concessions, political changes to the system, to the overarching political system in China. And that doesn't even touch on the whole development question, because the party considers the actions that it takes in terms of industrial policy, state-owned enterprises, and state support for technology firms. All of that, if not also technology espionage. The Communist Party of China sees all of that as necessary to the economic development of China. It really believes that it needs that in order to really ensure development, because it hypothetically could just allow the free market to decide and just sort of let the Chinese economy develop and evolve on its own, and maybe it could develop on its own like that. But the party is not about uncertainty, right? It's a top-down, hierarchical, centralized political system, and that engenders a political culture that is very risk-averse and does not like uncertainty. And so, if only for that reason, they really like plans. They really like industrial policy. They prefer a sure thing, and they feel like centralized policies like having industrial policy, state-owned enterprises, etc., is a more sure bet, is a more secure, safe way of ensuring economic development than just kind of leaving it to fate. And there's also an argument about unfair first mover advantage. Western developed societies kind of had their economies developed first, so you could say that kind of gives them an unfair advantage, and so developing societies in turn need a little bit of a help to overcome that unfair first mover advantage. That's kind of more of an abstract economic argument, though. I don't know that anybody's really making that, but I'm sure it would come up sooner or later if enough pressure were brought to bear on China, which hasn't really happened yet. That's something else we've discussed. The U.S. could probably get a lot more concessions out of China if they worked more with Europe. The U.S. by itself is an important market for China, but it's not as important as, the world. So if the other major market, that being Europe in the world, were to kind of combine the leverage of the U.S. and European markets together, they could bring a lot more pressure to bear, and the Chinese government would feel a lot more pressure to kind of do something, to kind of give something up. But that hasn't really happened. The Europeans are kind of, I'm sure the Europeans would like to work with the U.S. administration more, but they're a little cagey because they don't know how much they can really trust the Trump administration on that, because they have their own trade issues with Washington. Oh, I think I did skip that. Yeah, I did. Sorry. I skipped a question. My apologies. I'll get to that in a minute. But let's see. So on the China trade thing, I don't think the negotiation can really end really successfully. I would be surprised if it did. One of the things that I think the U.S. government wants to do at this point is to kind of decouple Chinese suppliers from the global economy, or at the very least, U.S. supply chain. And so it's kind of started, the tariffs are kind of an implicit way of doing that. And that would kind of solve a lot of problems. I mean, if both parties don't really trust each other, it kind of makes sense to kind of tamper down economic influence that each has over the other, so that one or the other cannot use that leverage in a potentially threatening way in the future. So it's no surprise that's kind of the direction things are going in. But that does bring pressure to bear on China. I don't think it's going to be enough to make them give major concessions. I don't think exports are an important enough a part of the Chinese economy at this point to really make that a deal, kind of make that a body blow for them. I think there's enough domestic demand and consumption. There's enough domestic consumption driving the Chinese economy at this point, and enough other countries that they could export to that won't be too big of a hit on the Chinese economy. It'll be a hit for sure. But I think that it's not going to be enough of a hit to make them want to change their ways, so to speak. But I bring it up because there was a survey by UBS of 200 manufacturers in China, and their findings were 1/3 were planning on leaving, and 1/3 had already moved some production. And it could be, those numbers could increase if no trade deal with the U.S. is kind of reached. Because up till now, a lot of manufacturing firms, specifically international manufacturing firms, have kind of rode the tariffs out. You know, there's been a lot of tariffs implemented by the U.S. against China, but a lot of manufacturing firms have kind of tried to ride it out thus far. You know, a lot of them bought a lot of stock to build up their inventories before tariffs kind of came into place. Well, there was additional tariffs put into place at near the end of last year, and so they built up inventories before that, and they've kind of been leaning on those inventories since then in the hope that there would be some kind of trade deal. But once those inventories kind of run out, then there is going to be a lot more economic pressure on their bottom line to kind of shift their supply chain to kind of get around these tariffs. So that's starting to happen now. It does seem like there is more of a trend in that direction. And again, you know, from a national security perspective for both, well, for the United States, if not also China, that could be beneficial. That could be a desirable outcome. In terms of economics, it's not great, but it does kind of deal with that trust issue. You know, is there an even playing field? Is everybody playing by the rules? Well, we can't really know, and the U.S. suspects that the Chinese government is not playing ball in that regard. So if that's the case, it does make sense to kind of wind down economic ties, at least to some degree. Again, not great for global economic growth, probably not great for Chinese or U.S. economic growth, but again, it kind of comes down to that overarching political and strategic issues. Those overarching political and economic strategic issues, rather. So that is kind of happening, and it could accelerate if no deal is made. That kind of that's something to watch. But I wanted to bring it up because I'd been surprised that even that many had already, you know, 1/3 planning on leaving. That's a pretty substantial number. A lot of firms in China are Chinese. A lot of manufacturing firms are Chinese, so those probably won't leave. They'll probably stick around. But it does look like that international supply chain that the U.S. is pressuring is starting to respond to that pressure. So that you could see a lot more traction in that regard going forward. Not clear what that's going to look like, because again, China's economy and society is kind of opaque. But it'll certainly be interesting to watch, and it'll have a big bearing on how the Chinese government treats its trade relations and economic policy going forward. So that's going to be a kind of a big metric that we can kind of use to measure that. And a final point on that, regardless of what happens, it's probably not going to result in a significant return of manufacturing jobs to the U.S. It's still kind of too uncompetitive. You know, more likely, firms moving out of China are going to move to places like Vietnam or Bangladesh or what have you, where it's still pretty cheap. But the U.S. is still not really all that competitive in that regard, so probably not going to see a lot there. So that's an update on the U.S.-China trade negotiation. And okay, so the question I accidentally skipped, I didn't mean to here. Can you please give us any insight into the Huawei situation with CFO Meng Wanzhou? I think that's how that's pronounced. Canada seems to be in between a rock and a hard place with China and US. I think this person asked this question last time too, and I kind of misread it. I kind of talked more about Huawei rather than the CFO situation. So for those not familiar with this, what this person is referring to, the chief financial officer of Huawei, which is a major Chinese technology firm, was, I don't want to say, I guess she was arrested by Canadian authorities at the request of the U.S. government. The U.S. government had requested extradition because they believed that they had evidence that Huawei had engaged in sanctions busting, which is to say that Huawei had illegally used a shell company to try to sell goods and services to Iran, which of course is a big no-no for the U.S. So they knew that she was in Canada. So there's actually quite a few Chinese in Canada now. A lot of Chinese nationals use Canada as a kind of safety valve. You know, they'll buy property there and try to get travel rights just in case something goes down in China. So there's been a lot of Chinese migration over there. So she was in
Vancouver housing market because of that.
Yeah, specifically because of that. But she was in Vancouver, and so she was arrested. She has not yet been extradited to the U.S. There's still a process, I think, that they kind of have to go through there. I suspect that she most likely will be. But the big question that arose was, to what degree is this just purely a bureaucratic thing where they're enforcing sanctions, or alternatively, to what degree is it tied into the U.S.-Chinese trade negotiation? Is the U.S. trying to put pressure on China by trying to put pressure on Huawei and its people? Because she's also connected. I think she's also the daughter of the guy who owns Huawei, or the CEO, or something to that effect. So, in China, this is, it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese Communist Party really interpreted it as a purely political, because that kind of thing is kind of how things are done in China's political system. Targeting people in a political rival's political network, even explicitly in their patronage network. That's a pretty standard tactic, and you've kind of seen Xi Jinping do that a lot over there with his rise to power. He's very much gone after a number of major political networks, kind of in that vein. So putting pressure on an individual like that is kind of seen as an aggressive move in China. But at the same time, I would think that they would kind of know enough about the U.S. political system to know that the U.S. doesn't generally do like that. Generally, or at least when it does, it's a little more direct about it. I think it probably more is the U.S. government just enforcing the sanctions regime, because that's pretty important to the whole Middle Eastern policy of the U.S. at this point. So I don't think it's really a political maneuver to put pressure on the Chinese, although I'm sure that the Trump administration would consider painting it as such to get a little extra leverage. Again, it kind of comes down to the degree to which the Chinese think it was politically motivated and the degree to which the Trump administration paints it as such. But I don't think the move itself was done explicitly for political reasons. They've gone after Huawei before for sanctions busting. In fact, they actually had an agreement with them whereby they agreed to kind of defer punishment, or at least mitigate punishment, in exchange for Huawei making some management changes. Is that what it was? Or some other business changes to the way they run things, in order to kind of get the confidence of U.S. regulators that they were no longer engaging in that kind of trade. So this is not unprecedented in that sense. Huawei's kind of gotten in trouble for this before. And going after the CFO in particular, I don't know why specifically they went after her as opposed to the company. Maybe that specific decision could have been political. But in general, going after Huawei and its people for sanctions busting, again, not unprecedented and not necessarily tied in with the overarching trade negotiations. I know that the Chinese government has been saying it's politically motivated and that they resent it and that they're going to go after Canada if they kind of extradite her. But that itself may just be part of the trade negotiations. That itself may just the Chinese government pretending to be offended in order to try to get some leverage on Canada and to try to help out this woman who's being threatened with extradition. That also is a very traditional Chinese tactic, to pretend to be offended in order to try to get concessions. That's
I am upset!
That's an old communist thing, actually. It's an old communist canard. I've been doing that for a long time. But it's hard to say. I'm not an insider in the government, in the U.S., so I can't judge really to what degree the Chinese government or the U.S. government are viewing it, how they're perceiving the issue. Let's see. So, I don't think I skipped any others. Yeah, I think I got them all. Thank you to Fuzzy Cord for pointing that out. Let's see, so where were we? Do you think our society needs to remove the liberal conservative labeling from Republicans, Democrats? I don't think it would really change anything if you did. I wouldn't mind. I would love it, because then I wouldn't have to qualify every time I use the word liberal with the fact that I'm referencing classical liberalism. That would certainly make my life a little bit easier. But I mean, beyond that, in terms of labels, I don't think it would really make a difference. I mean, they would just be replaced by new labels, and those new labels would become just as politically charged. It really didn't take long for the word progressive to become, politically charged. Once the Democrats started kind of shifting towards that instead of liberal. So I don't think it would really it would be a superficial change. It could be a nice temporary shift. It could be a kind of a sign of good faith, a sign that people are trying to make politics a little less partisan. Kind of a not a fig leaf. What's the word I want? What am I looking for? Olive branch, an extension of an olive branch. But that would be purely temporary. even if everybody agreed to kind of move in that direction, it would probably just be temporary. So, yeah, it would not be a substantive move in any case, I would argue. What are the political and economic implications about permanent Mars habitation? That's way ahead of the curve.
Well, one point to kind of add into this, we've talked about geography and how it relates to how nations form, how certain nations are more successful than others, how trade works. This would be an unprecedented distance from point A to point B in terms of economy. So it's really tough to say that, say the Mars colonization really takes off, to be able to send stuff back is a big logistical challenge. Sending stuff there is a big challenge. So it would almost be our first experiment in a sort of independent, distant external economy that can kind of sustain itself. Mm-hmm. It's too far away to just send a boat over or drive a truck through space. You have to send a rocket, which is really expensive, and it takes a long time. Mm-hmm. So it's very disjointed. I've heard that they're saying if you want to go to Mars, you should kind of commit to it for the rest of your existence, which is a big thing. It's going to cut down on the number of volunteers to go to Mars. But yeah, it's going to be an epic meme, I think, regardless of how it pans out. And also a new one where we don't really have precedent for how that kind of thing would function. The closest thing I think we could relate it to is probably Antarctica, where that's a place with a similarly habitable climate. It's actually awful to live in. And you're kind of trying to have the fewest number of people, and you want to have a really good reason for them to be there, because there isn't a ton of natural resource that you're just either farming or ranching or like industry, stuff like that. It's very inconvenient. So Mars is kind of that frontier of, yes, it is real estate, but no, it's not really a Garden of Eden. So what are you looking for there?
Yeah, I think, in order to kind of gauge the implications, you would really need to get into specifics about what kind of economic activity would be going on there. If it were mining, then the thing you were mining would have to be very valuable to kind of justify the cost of being there. But if you did have something that valuable, then having more of that very valuable thing would presumably make it more cost efficient to use goods that had that as an input back on Earth. So if you could substantially increase the supply of something that you can only really get on Mars, on Earth, that could have some significant economic repercussions depending on how that good was being used. But again, I don't know enough about material sciences to know what such a good would be or what you could find on Mars that would kind of fit that.
One funny one for us is on Earth, if we're sufficiently polluting and destroying the resources we have to find similar resources in a pure form, we may need to go elsewhere, such as water, for example. Mars does have water, as we've discovered. So if we mess up our water on Earth enough, then maybe that will be a point of value. The flip side is, as research and development is progressing, we may also find ways of improving the quality of the water that's on Earth. So it's sort of a technological research race of which path is the most optimal. And then you have people who are in the game who are kind of wild cards and jokers, like we've got Mr. What's his name? The Tesla guy.
Musk.
Yeah, Elon Musk, and you have Virgin Air, this guy as well. The super rich who are kind of like, yeah, let's do it, because that entrenches yourself in the annals of history. So sometimes you go for the less ideal option just because it's more memorable, and you build a legend for yourself. So that's another sort of point of momentum in this quest to colonize the stars is you also kind of want to stamp your name on that legacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think...
Why don't we shoot a car into space? Because we can.
Well, if you got the money. But beyond economic implications, I don't know what the political implications would be. Yeah, I assume that that would kind of be worked out more beforehand. I mean, if you're at the point where you can substantively engage in some kind of economic, economically viable economic activity on Mars, presumably the political issue of, jurisdiction and who owns what on Mars would have already been brought up beforehand. But I have no idea how that would work out. It would kind of depend on the political climate on Earth and just, just that. It would just depend on political climate, what interest groups were at play and how much how influential they were and how much different governments really wanted to, negotiate maybe a peaceful agreement wherein nobody really owns it, kind of like with Antarctica, or if maybe they compete to try to carve up spheres of influence, or if they just explicitly claim big chunks of Mars. I mean, I have no idea where it would go. It's probably so far in the future that it's impossible to really predict with any accuracy.
No, I don't know. I think it's not one of those like linear progression things where you get closer and closer to it. It's kind of like if you can fire up the public, then oftentimes you can take a really big leap. Like going to the moon was something that we really stretched for because of the symbolism. That was the period where you have East versus West, US versus USSR. Who is better? If we're not going to blow each other up with nukes, how can we really show the world that we're better? And the moon was like that really big, obvious challenge that both sides can go for, and kind of, instead of racing by blowing each other up, you just point the rockets somewhere else. So Mars could be one of those. It's kind of one of those questions of how do you create the conflict that gets people to prioritize it? Because we have a lot of problems on Earth as it is.
Yeah. Well, I think there was an agreement made, though, by the UN that said that countries could not own the moon, specifically. So I think that was kind of sorted out in the process. Kind of Googling it here, and I think there was a...
But what about city-states? Can city-states own the moon?
I think technically they would count as countries. But apparently people can own the moon. Apparently some guy's been selling real estate on it for the past 30 years. Yeah. Dennis Hope.
That's like when you give someone a star. Dude, would you like to purchase this star? It'll be yours, and you can tell everyone that it's yours.
Yeah, the treaty in question was the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. It was signed in 1967, apparently. So yeah, that they did kind of talk about it beforehand. That was kind of a... They knew that somebody was going to go to the moon, so let's just hash out some of the legal issues now. But yeah, you're right. You can kind of... that can become a very sudden issue, depending on technological innovation or political will. But again, I have no idea. Yeah, I mean, that seems like more a long-term thing. I don't think it's really a priority for now. And until it becomes at least somewhat feasible, or somebody generates the political will to do it, or whatever, I don't think it's going to be an issue. Yeah, it's a long-term issue, and I can't predict anything over the long term. There's too many variables, so it's anybody's guess. It could go any number of ways. Maybe it would be ideal if it ended up like the moon tonight, where it's not really exclusively owned by any particular country. But then if you are having economic activity, that does kind of raise the specter of, jurisdiction, etc. It could be something like that on the moon soon, so there may need to be an update on the treaty. But I haven't heard anything about that either. We'll see. I'll file that under "we'll see" for now. What do you think about the headline, U.S. suspends nuclear arms control treaty with Russia? Seems about right. I don't, I don't know what you want me to say. That seems pretty direct and to the point. I mean, the U.S. did technically suspend its participation, I guess, in the INF treaty. I think it was the INF treaty. I think I remember talking about that some previous episode. We kind of went over it. It doesn't really matter that much. You know, Russia was already kind of violating the terms of the agreement, and the U.S. can't do anything now that it's out of the agreement that it wanted to do before when it was under the agreement. So it doesn't really substantively change anything. You know, I don't think the U.S. is going to really go out of its way to develop a bunch of weapons that it didn't have much interest in developing, and Russia's just going to keep doing what it's doing. That's pretty much Russia's modus operandi. We're just going to keep doing what we've been doing in any number of areas. So yeah, it's not really a big deal per se. Ideally, the agreement would still be in place. Obviously, it's better if arms control agreements are adhered to, but you know, there's disagreements on how to implement it. So that's just going to depend on future negotiations. But I don't see anything wrong with the headline per se. Do you think there's sufficient growth and collaboration between law enforcement and the intelligence community since 9/11? Probably. There was quite a bit immediately after. There was quite a bit of policy change and reform trying to push such coordination immediately after. And I suspect it's grown quite a bit. Whether or not it's sufficient is kind of, I don't know enough about that particular issue to judge whether or not it's sufficient. And, you know, sufficiency is kind of a subjective read in any case. So you'll probably get different answers depending on who you ask. My general impression is that it's at least workable. You know, there hasn't been a major terrorist attack since 9/11. There's been a couple near misses, I think, but
people have had to take off their shoes going through the airport.
Yeah, but that's not really local. That is what he said. Between law enforcement and the intelligence community. That's not really law enforcement per se. So I wouldn't call that collaboration.
It's just inconvenient.
Yeah, super inconvenient and probably a bit dumb. That's the nature of security theater. It's meant to make you feel safe, not be safe. And there's enough people that find that think it's effective and a good deterrent to allow the government to keep doing it. I guess you could argue that it's legitimate in so much as hypothetically you could put a bomb in your shoe. There was that one guy that tried to do it. But it's easy enough to put it in other places. I'm surprised there hasn't really been another attempt to blow up a plane. Enough people have kind of gotten around TSA that it seems like it would be feasible. I don't know, maybe either security is better than I think it is, or maybe the terrorists are getting lazy. Or maybe just don't care enough to bother.
I mean,
Plenty enough.
It does carry a pretty substantial risk, you know.
Yeah.
Being a terrorist is not one of the safest professions that you could go for.
For sure. And there's lots of other opportunities in the Middle East. Yeah, that is kind of one of the effects of having a big conflict in the Middle East. It kind of takes extremists away from their home countries and puts them someplace else. You know, the Saudis have done that enough. So maybe that's part of the reason as well. But yeah, as far as I know, there's decent collaboration between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. It's maybe not perfect. You know, I'm sure there's areas where it could improve. And there's always going to be a certain amount of friction and communication between different agencies, especially at ones at radically different levels of government like that. But you know, as far as I know, whenever there's been a threat that the intelligence agencies have known about, they've been pretty good about communicating with. You know, if the person asking this question has counterexamples, you know, I'd be more than happy to, you know, hear them. You know, they may know more about this than I do. Let's see. I think that's it for those new questions. else have we got? Ah, yeah. Have you heard about the WTO lately?
Nope.
They're working on some new negotiations on digital trade, specifically, which is kind of a new thing for them. But I should specify it's not the WTO per se. It's not. It's actually WTO members. There's 76 WTO members are negotiating amongst themselves some kind of a future agreement on digital trade, and it may or may not involve the WTO directly. They're kind of cagey on that, but for now, it's nominally within the framework of the WTO. And it's also unclear exactly what's going to be involved, since digital trade is sort of ambiguous, but nominally that's kind of the direction they want to home in on. But it's interesting news because this is kind of a new way that multilateral trade negotiations could go forward. You know, the WTO has been kind of stuck in the Doha round of negotiations for a couple decades now, I think. Going on 30 years or something like that. It's been a long time. So the WTO as an institution has not really grown much over the past few decades. And part of the reason for that is because the negotiations had been occurring basically with all of the members. You know, all of the members were negotiating a new agreement, and there was always some block of countries that were resistant to some aspect of the new agreement. And that's kind of why Doha hasn't really gone anywhere. So now this new approach is to just take the countries that are willing to make concessions for closer economic integration, for more free trade, and kind of have them split off and negotiate a sort of WTO plus, either, you know, agree voluntarily to their own provisions within the WTO, or maybe to agree to separate provisions as part of a separate arrangement. But it would kind of get around those countries that had been kind of holding up progress on that front. So you could see more global trade rules and regulations and agreements going forward based on this style of agreement. Maybe not this specific negotiation, but this idea of having countries sort of break off and hold their own multilateral negotiations. That's kind of a new trend, at least for the WTO. And it could also be a framework that could be used to get around the U.S., because the U.S. has been holding up the what was it? They've been holding up the appointment of, I think, arbiters. I think that's what it was. Arbitration judges that are used to kind of settle disputes between WTO members, complaints and whatnot. And it's been going on long enough that it's kind of getting to a critical point. You know, it's getting to the point where there's not enough judges to reach a quorum, which means that they can't arbitrate. You know, they just can't sit and hold an arbitration hearing. And at that point, you know, either the U.S. is going to have to, well, either the rest of the WTO is going to have to give in to the U.S.'s demands and offer some concession, or the WTO will kind of cease to function as an institution. So if other WTO members don't want to give the U.S. those concessions that it's one thing they could do is just voluntarily identify a separate system, a separate institution to arbitrate their disputes, and just kind of agree voluntarily that that's going to be a substitute for the missing arbitration judges and the role that they were performing. So hypothetically, that is a direction that they could go in to try to get around the U.S. holding up those appointments. It would be purely voluntary, though, and other countries could kind of break off and kind of work more with the U.S. to try to put pressure on the others. It's not really clear how that would work out. But hypothetically, that is a framework that could come into play going forward as that issue kind of becomes more critical. And you might see that in the news not too long from now. How are we doing?
We good? We are 9 hours, 21 minutes into the stream. How are you energy-wise? And water-wise?
Doing all right. I still got some left.
Okay. How about we do 20-minute warning?
20-minute warning. Got it. Let's see what else I got here. Some of this stuff I'll save for podcasts. Some of this stuff I have enough notes for maybe an episode. So I'm starting to kind of partition those off.
Sweet.
Oh, there was that worldwide threat assessment thing. You might have heard about that, actually. That was basically the U.S. intelligence officials gave a presentation to Congress, the Worldwide Threat Assessment Report. And I think that's something they do every year, maybe annually. But the media kind of got into it because some of the things in the report kind of contradicted some of the things that the Trump administration had been talking about. So the report argued that North Korea probably will not give up its nuclear weapons. So that kind of contradicted the Trump administration's line that it is kind of successfully engaging with the North Korean government, and that it's that those negotiations are moving forward. And then they also, the report also argued that Iran is adhering to the Iran nuclear deal, and that it's not building nukes currently. And they also argued that the Islamic State has been hobbled, but that it's still a security threat in the region, and that it's just going to slip underground and potentially pop up again at a later opportune date. So the media kind of jumped in and kind of contrasted that with the Trump administration and made a big deal about it. I didn't think it was as big a deal as it was made out to be, though. I think the most legitimate claim you could make there is that the report kind of contradicted them on the North Korea issue the most. That's where the biggest contradiction was. But you could also argue that that was more of a negotiating tactic, that the report was kind of just pointing that out publicly to try to lean on the North Korean government. You know, it may well be that the Trump administration itself is kind of doing a good cop, bad cop thing, where the administration says that it thinks the North Koreans are moving forward and that they're engaging, and then kind of points to the report as an example of how institutional actors in the government are more skeptical, and that if the North Koreans don't want those actors to become the leading voices on North Korea policy, that it would behoove them to give more concessions and move the denuclearization process faster. That's a possibility, though. That's just my potential. That's a potential reading. But that was kind of the bigger issue there. The Iran thing was kind of a non-starter. I mean, saying that Iran is not building nukes does not really contradict Trump policy per se, because the Trump policy was not to say they're building nukes and we need to do more. Their policy was to say that Iran was doing a bunch of other stuff in the region besides building nukes, that sanctions should be applied in order to try to counter. So saying that they're not building nukes actually kind of plays into the Trump administration's narrative, because they had argued that applying sanctions again would not result in them starting up their nuclear program again. And that actually the report kind of bears that out. You know, there's sufficient incentive for Iran not to restart its nuclear program, for them not to do so even in the face of the U.S. pulling out of the agreement and reapplying sanctions. So that wasn't really too ugly for the administration. The IS thing, meh. You know, I mean, the report says that IS is still a threat. The Trump administration had been moving away from that, arguing that the Islamic State had kind of mostly been dealt with and was almost done. There's some contradiction there, but I mean, there's not all that much. I mean, the administration itself has kind of been waxing and waning about how big a threat IS is and how much it wants to stay in Syria. So that just seems like more of the usual indecisive Syria policy stuff that we've seen in Washington for a number of years. So the biggest issue there was the North Korea thing. That was the biggest contradiction in terms, but even that wasn't really all that embarrassing. The administration does plenty of embarrassing things, but this was not really the most embarrassing thing for them, I don't think. It was a bit overwrought in the media. Let's see, we talked about Roger Stone, we talked about Brexit, talked about Afghanistan. Let's see, we got Venezuela too. Pakistan started putting pressure on the Taliban to negotiate with the U.S. That's part of the reason those negotiations have been progressing more. You know, they arrested the Taliban's former religious affairs minister ahead of a visit from the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation. Ahead of a title. That's a hell of a title. In order to kind of push them to negotiate with the U.S., in order to kind of push them into those peace negotiations. And so if the Pakistanis are kind of playing ball on that, that's a good sign as well. Because one of the reasons the Taliban have been able to drag the war out so long is because they have been able to use Pakistan as a kind of safe haven, if not explicit Pakistani support. So if the Pakistani government is starting to apply pressure a bit, that'll significantly change the calculus in the conflict, and the peace agreement would be much more likely. So them arresting that guy was a very positive sign in that regard. It might also be, though, that they're not as interested in peace as they are in avoiding pressure. The Pakistani economy is not doing great. They've been kind of fishing around for some economic assistance, so it might also have to do with that. see. Did we have another? Oh, yeah. Okay. How come Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, advanced their economies so damn fast? What don't other nations learn from them?
Ooh, can I start this?
Oh, go ahead.
So, you have the context of what happened before they were destroyed. They were in a very strong position, which a lot of that is based on the cultural norms of how the country is currently operating. And yes, they did lose, but they also kind of demonstrated a lot of just economic might and military might during that time. So for them to bounce back and then become a leader isn't surprising in that context. Yes, a bunch of stuff was blown up, but if you're able to build things and kind of be industrious and value a lot of the human attributes that comprise building a strong society, for them to bounce back, I think, is pretty expected.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, things can go kaboom, but people can also rebuild what was destroyed.
Yeah.
And then if you're rebuilding it, that also creates space to have the most modern version of a thing. And it also gave them some time to reflect on a lot of their biggest flaws and to put that in front of the people of, we must not repeat this mistake, which can end up being an advantage because they can sometimes distance themselves even further from the issue than countries that didn't make the same mistake to the same extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good answer. That's pretty much what I was going to say. Yeah, Germany and Japan had a lot of human capital before World War II, and that largely survived the war. So when they started rebuilding, they still had access to all of that skilled labor, all of those education institutions, etc. You know, to say nothing of good governance and strong governance, good governance, relatively good governance, and strong institutions. So that was already kind of in place. To say nothing of, you know, rule of law and respect for authority, that kind of thing. So, you know, those sort of soft factors, those sort of cultural and social and political factors were still there after the war, and so they were able to kind of utilize those to rebuild very quickly. You know, there's also, you know, the Marshall Plan, you know, economic assistance, and the international, you know, whatever you want to call it, basically international trade, the return of international trade after a long period of being shut down during and after the Great Depression. That also helped out Germany and Japan a lot because it gave them markets that they didn't previously have access to. You know, getting shut off from global markets really hurt Japan during the Great Depression in particular, if not also Germany, but especially Japan. So once they kind of, after the war, were granted access to those again, that really helped out a lot as well. But otherwise, yeah, it's, you know, they mostly had the principal factors you need to have a really good, successful economy already in place. And, you know, the material destruction of the war was, you know, significant, but they were able to replace all of that with pretty modern equipment, with the assistance of their own effort, but also some foreign assistance from the U.S. and etc. So they just had everything in place except the stuff, and the stuff was pretty easily replaced in the grand scheme of things. So the second part of the question, why don't other nations learn from them? Well, I mean, referencing the earlier answer, I mean, it's very hard to replicate those kinds of advantages. I mean, good governance, rule of law, I mean, strong institutions, respect for authority, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is cultural stuff that is very difficult to impose on a society. You know, it's something that kind of evolves in a society. It's not something you can learn from, per se.
Hey guys, you should value democracy and the strength of institutions. Oh, okay. I guess we'll do that. Yeah. Hey guys, you should have checks and balances so the branches of your government don't spiral out of control. Oh, okay. We'll flip the switch and turn that on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not simple at all. You know, changing cultures is very, very difficult, especially when you're going up against entrenched expectations and assumptions. And those sorts of things just do not change easily. You know, that's one of the reasons inflation is so difficult to tackle. When people expect inflation, then they just raise prices no matter what you do. And it's very, very difficult to change those expectations. So culture is hard to change, and that's kind of the principal factor that really helped them out. Well, one of the principal factors. I mean, the other factor is burn your country to the ground so you can replace it with new stuff. Technically feasible, but probably not a good idea.
It's a bold move. Let's see if it pays off.
You know, burning down your country for insurance money is not generally considered a good national strategy for economic development, so I would not recommend that. Yeah, it's just a lot of the factors were very, what you would call path dependent. They were sort of down to historical factors and social factors that are not really replicable per se in other societies, or at least not easily replicable. So I would say that would be why other countries do not replicate them in that regard. Let's see. Got that. Save that. I don't know how interested people are in Chinese electric car industrial policy, so I might save that for later. Oh, was there anything else that you kind of wanted to touch on, Neuro?
I think you hit the main points for me, at least from what I saw. I haven't been keeping very close tabs on the news. I've been doing about 50 to 60 hours of uptime per week with the stream.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Working hard.
Yeah. It's been good. I think I was around rank 3 for StarCraft streams for the month of January. There was 1 week that I was rank 1. I did have some promoted stuff where you get both the Blizzard launcher and the Twitch front page at the same time, which is absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so our average has been over 1,000 viewers at a time this month overall, which is ridiculous. I think last year it was mostly between 300 to 400, so this is a major upswing.
Wow, man, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Congrats. More power to you. Trying to look through here and see what I can get for you. I guess I could try the left column. Let's see. Now we already did that. Post-World War I Europe. That could be interesting. That was a giant clusterfuck. Have you, are you familiar with sort of the aftermath of World War I, Neuro?
It's worth a refresher.
It's worth a refresher. Okay. So one thing that started before the war even ended was the Russian Civil War. And that itself was a whole thing. It's a major historical conflict. Between communists and pretty much everybody else. Just Democrats, monarchs, liberals, authoritarians, just, I mean, anybody and everybody who did not like communism was pretty much a part of the whites. And then they fought against the communists, who were pretty much workers and farmers. Probably more workers. And not a few people who were coerced into fighting. You know, there was a number of Tsarist officers who had their families kidnapped by the Soviets, and they were threatened, basically. Well, the officers were threatened with the murder of their families if they did not fight for the Red Army. So that proved to be a pretty effective tactic in a lot of cases. So that was going on, and it was extremely brutal. But in addition to the Russian Civil War, there was also instability in Poland and a number of other countries that had kind of been carved out of the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian. And one of the big problems after the war ended was who gets what bit of territory. Because if you're going to create a Poland, you may not want to be in that Poland if you're not ethnically Polish. And so there was a lot of ethnic competition, if you will. Well, just explicit ethnic violence is basically what it was. You know, a lot of different territories had minorities that didn't want to be in this, that, or the other country, preferred to be in another country. And so that created a lot of tension, violence, and a lot of referenda. We already talked about how much fun referenda are. It wasn't any different then, anything worse. Well, I think the city of Lvov was a pretty good example of that. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's had a number of different names. But the city was mostly ethnically Polish, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was surrounded by rural areas that were ethnically Ukrainian, I believe. So there was a big issue about what to do with Lvov and the surrounding region. Do you give it to the Ukraine, which was kind of technically an independent state at that time, sort of. That kind of ties into the Russian Civil War, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But there was a discussion about where it would end up, or maybe even an independent Ruthenian republic. But the Poles who lived in Lvov were not interested in any of that. They wanted to be in Poland. So there was a bit kind of a short war that broke out between Poles in Lvov and the people in the surrounding area. And eventually it did end up in Poland once the Polish army intervened. And outside powers didn't really care that much because, the whole region had turned into a mess, and they were pretty content to let everybody kind of figure it out themselves. But in addition to the ethnic violence and the giant Russian Civil War, there was also a brief communist takeover in Hungary. There was briefly a communist government there. It didn't last very long, but it was enough to scare the shit out of everybody. There was a number of attempted communist coups and movements and whatnot at the time. But I think Hungary was the only one where they really seized an entire government. Other than Russia, anyway. I think in Central Europe, that was the only successful case. And they didn't last very long at all. Everybody was pretty quick to jump on the communists. Keep in mind, at the time, communists were still seen then as just explicit extremists. And not even like, just even more out beyond the pale than they're seen as now, basically. Keep in mind, before that, Europe was defined by Victorian sensibilities. Victorian Europe saw anarchists and communists and other radicals as all being kind of the same cloth. And they were sort of disregarded in a similar fashion. So having communists actually seizing power was really scary. That was seen as extremists seizing power and potentially spreading. So Hungary had a communist government, Russian Civil War, ethnic violence everywhere, and already talked about Lvov. Brest-Litovsk Treaty already kind of... Brest-Litovsk Treaty was the treaty that ended Russia's involvement in World War I, and that was during the war, technically, but it was important because as part of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, in which technically I believe that was the communist government at that point, the communist government gave massive territorial concessions to the Germans. Just broad swaths of what had been Western Tsarist Russia were given up. And I don't think Germany intended to annex them outright. I think most of them were intended to be turned into puppet states. The Baltic states were, originally anyway, intended to be puppet states. And then there was the Ukraine, which was meant to be a puppet state. And then I think there was also a provisional Polish government of some kind created temporarily. I think that was kind of the kernel of what became post-war Poland after the fact. And so that treaty kind of set the stage for a lot of that ethnic violence that happened after the war ended, because a lot of that territory was originally kind of intended to be a German sphere of influence, and the German army itself kind of provided order and propped up the governments there. But then, the Germans lost the war, so the German army left, and so then something had to fill the void. Something filled the vacuum, and that was basically a Mad Max movie. So that kind of set the stage for that, as well as later conflicts. The Soviet Union kind of made it its business to try to reclaim almost all of that territory that it lost in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and it was actually successful for the most part in doing that. I think Finland was the only bit they never really got back. Finland had been a part of Russia, but after World War I, it became independent, and I think the Russians tried to get it back in the Winter War, but were never able to pull it off, and kind of didn't think it was worth it during World War II. They had kind of Nazi Germany to worry about, so Finland was a little bit of a sideshow at that point. Lithuania was a bit of a problem too, because they had a city that had a lot of Poles in it, I think. I think it was Vilnius. I think that was explicitly Vilnius. Somebody from Europe can maybe help me out with that on the pronunciation. But Lithuania and Poland actually have a lot of history together. They used to be kind of superpower in the region way back in the medieval era. It was when they were the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And sort of one of the legacies of that was that this major city in Lithuania still had a significant Polish population, and it had a lot of Polish history. And so Poland, after the war, wanted to claim it. It wanted it to explicitly be a part of Poland, but Lithuania wasn't interested in that because it was the capital of Lithuania. They didn't want to give up their capital. It had just as much history and cultural significance to the ethnic Lithuanians. So that led to a confrontation, and eventually they actually did lose it. Vilnius ended up being in the new Poland. And that kind of poisoned relations for a long time. It was kind of one of the reasons that countries in Eastern Europe were not as willing to work with each other when the Soviets and Nazi Germans kind of started rolling through and picking off countries and establishing spheres of influence. There was a lot of mistrust between Eastern European countries because of actions taken during this post-World War I period. And then there was Czechoslovakia, which actually did really well. Kind of amid the chaos, Czechoslovakia emerged and kind of became a relatively stable democracy and actually did pretty well for itself. It was kind of considered the one major success story from that period after World War I. And there was a particular affinity for it in the United States because apparently U.S. negotiators during the Versailles negotiation really pushed hard to create Czechoslovakia. So that was kind of seen as being partly a U.S. baby. You know, the U.S. kind of played a big role in the creation originally, among other actors, I'm sure. I don't know the full history, but because the U.S. had been involved, people in the U.S. kind of had this weird attachment to Czechoslovakia. And that was one of the reasons why later on, when Czechoslovakia fell, for one, and as a result of Munich, that a lot of people in the U.S. were upset about that. Even more so in 1947, when the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. You know, Poland, you know, a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe before World War II had been explicitly authoritarian, but Czechoslovakia was not. So after World War II, when communist governments were set up in Eastern Europe, there was not as much angst in cases like Poland or Hungary or what have you that had been authoritarian before, as there was with Czechoslovakia, which had been a democracy before. So there was a sense that people in the West had failed Czechoslovak democracy and really let them down by not going out of their way to try to hold up their democratic achievement. So just kind of a quick run through of that. That's a very superficial history, I know, but I thought even a superficial history might be interesting to people. Do we have another question?
I think there was one. I don't know what it is. But wait, there's more.
Oh, God. What do you think about the Macedonia-Greece name issue and quote-unquote big forces making Macedonia to change its name in force, putting in jail the ex-premier Nikola Gruevski, and he escaped the country buying asylum from Hungary. Now the country is going through... Yeah, I think it's asylum. Oh, right. Sorry. I keep mispronouncing that. Buying asylum in Hungary. Now the country is going through constitutional changes, renaming to Northern Macedonia and having two languages, Albanian, USA/CIA favorite, and Northern Macedonia. What do I think about the name issue? You know, keep in mind I'm an outsider. I don't live in the Balkans, and I'm not in Macedonia or Greece, so it seems like a very bizarre, strange issue. I mean, it's just a name. I don't even know why the Greeks think it's a big deal. From what I read, I actually did read a little bit about this recently, most of the consternation in Greece over the issue is specifically from voters in the province of Macedon, which is kind of where the issue kind of stems from. Greece has a province of Macedon, and the fear has been that if Macedonia is allowed to call itself Macedonia, that somehow that implies a Macedonian claim on the Greek province of Macedon. And apparently most people in Greece don't care about that, except for the people in Macedon. But the thing is, there's enough people in that province to make the province politically influential and powerful enough to make it a major national issue. So I think that's kind of more where it comes from the Greek end of it. As for Macedonia, I can't really blame them for not wanting to change their country, because it is kind of an arbitrary ask on the part of Greece. And really, if Macedonia does change its name to Northern Macedonia, and then gets into NATO and gets into the European Union, is there really anything stopping it from changing its name back? That seems like it would be a good policy platform for a populist political party to run on, and I don't know that there would be anything that Greece could do with that. Yeah, it seems like a kind of a sideshow. It seems like it's something that political parties in both countries are just using to whip up voters, but that it's otherwise not really that substantive. That's kind of been my reading of it anyway. I mean, there's nothing being changed now that couldn't hypothetically be changed later. So, if you're Macedonian, just kind of lie low for a while, and then once you kind of get what you need, get that EU membership, then you're pretty much set to kind of reverse all those changes and snub Greece. I don't think there would be much they could do. I hadn't heard about putting in... I had not heard about them going after Nikolai Gruevsky. That's news to me, so I'd have to read more about that. I had read that there was a referendum in Macedonia about the name change, and that it actually got voted down because of opposition from just this, that, or the other group, and that the government ended up pushing it through anyway, because technically the referendum was non-binding. UK, you could learn a thing or two. I know, that's a joke. I know it was non-binding. Relax.
Got him.
I can just feel the anger from here.
Roasted. I mean, roasted is the word of the day in the stream, so it's appropriate. Today. Tomorrow, or the next time if you did that, it would be really inappropriate, but it's fine today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your tolerance.
Good timing.
Yeah, so I'll have to read more about Nikolai Gruevsky. I had read about the government pushing it through despite the referendum failing, but that doesn't really surprise me. That's getting out of the getting into the EU and into NATO has been kind of a long-term goal for the Macedonian government, or at least this particular political party. I'm sure there's opposition amongst certain groups. I don't doubt that they're backed by Russia, because I know that Russia wants the footprint in the region. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words today. I don't know that the U.S. really cares that much. Yeah, I know he infers here that the CIA kind of likes the idea of Albanian being an official language. Maybe they do. I don't think the rest of the government really cares. I doubt many people in the rest of the U.S. government could even find Macedonia on a map, let alone care that much about its internal politics. I think it's only an issue for the U.S., in part because of Russia, because there's been more concern about the Balkans ever since tensions with Russia started to escalate. And partly because it's more of a European issue, and the Europeans have been asking the U.S. to kind of take a more active role. And there was also individual effort on the part of a U.S. diplomat. He was kind of taking the lead on that. He had been there for a long time and was trying to mediate between Greece and Macedonia to try to reach that deal that was eventually struck and that people have been voting on. So I don't really see it as like a vast conspiracy to get Macedonia into NATO. It's not like NATO really needs Macedonia. No offense. I'm just saying.
Dude, they were the champions back in the day.
Oh god, look what you've done, Neuro.
Way back in the day, dude.
Look what you did.
Oh no.
That's kind of the whole crux of the issue, because the Macedonians say that they're descended from those Macedonians. And the Macedonians who live in Greece say that they're not. And that's a big part of the dispute in itself. And you just picked a side on the internet.
So that sounds like a yaha nah sort of a situation.
Yeah. Yeah, you can expect a lot of hate mail. Have fun with that.
Uh-oh. Well, someone's descended from them. Who is it?
Somebody must.
We need to get to the bottom of this. It's all about symbolism.
Oh god, yeah. It's super important, especially in the Balkans. But I don't know that anybody really is anymore. There's been so much migration through the region from so many different groups. There's probably not a lot of the original ancient population left. Genetically, I'm sure there's some, but there's been so much intermixing. Probably not even remotely pure anymore. So that's just a quick read on the Macedonia issue. It's not... I've never really seen it as like being a major strategic issue in the region. It just seems like this weird political artifact left over from the 90s. I'm open to criticism on that, so if there are other opinions, I certainly welcome them. I'd certainly like to read about them. I'm sure people definitely have strong opinions on it, so I would be more than happy to read them. It's always interesting getting the perspective of people who actually live in the regions that we talk about. I especially like that. So, if this person wants to kind of put their view on the issue into chat, I would appreciate it. I'm certainly interested in see what they think and, what the perception is in Macedonia of the issue. I'm assuming this person is Macedonia because they seem to have a particular opinion on it. Let's see. So how is that? How are we? I think that's 20 minutes about.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of the game, so go another 10.
Oh, cool.
Unless you're tired, and then you can go slumber, whatever you need to do.
Oh, it's fine.
You're not bound to the broadcast. There have been a couple fun comments, so one of my favorite things is when we get a brand new, unique viewer, and they hear you say words, and one of those words is tied to some government or politics somewhere in the world. And someone so far has said that it sounds like this is a propaganda stream now. And it made me think, what are we pushing? Say that this is a propaganda segment. I would say the main things that we're pushing, correct me if I'm wrong. Shit is complicated. We don't really know, and we'll see what happens. I think that would be the gospel truth that we're trying to push on people who are listening to this.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of accusations thrown around. You know, I think one of my favorites was the day that what was it? There was somebody who was saying that I sounded like a conservative, and then like an hour later, there was somebody who was saying that he knew what I was doing, that he knew that I was pushing a leftist bias onto people.
So that cancels out, so you're good.
I'm guessing they didn't talk to each other. Yeah, I've been called a Stalinist on here. I've been accused of being a neocon. There's a whole range of stuff we've been through on here. I strive to try to be impartial. That's kind of what I'm aiming for.
Well, to me and to some of the viewers, it's almost to a painful extent because they want to know which sports team you're cheering for. And you won't just say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm a leftist, I'm a conservative. You're just like, I'm just trying to be impartial and like, I need to know.
You know, if you want to root for a sports team, root for the New England Patriots. They seem to have it together.
You just pissed off like half the viewership. Actually, to be fair, we have a lot of Europeans who think that it's all stupid anyway, so you probably pissed off like 10 people.
Oh man.
Yeah.
10 people.
Good luck.
I can top that. Yeah, with the right topic, probably pull it off. Let's see. What else do we have? I don't know. What do you think about the, Actually, you're busy. I'll leave you to it.
No, it's fine. It's not like there's a huge battle that's totally destroying my third base or anything.
Did we ever talk about Sri Lanka? Specifically about the drama last year?
The first thing that comes to mind when you say Sri Lanka is Tamil Tigers, but...
Yeah. But not them. They're kind of dead right now. Quite literally, in fact. But they could come back eventually, but that's a whole other conversation. Well, in case I didn't go over it before, I can try to see if I can do this from memory. Basically, after the Sri Lankan Civil War, the Rajapaksa government, which was in power, was not particularly conciliatory towards the conquered Tamil populations and regions. They said that they did do some things, but in general, they were not being treated great. You know, the Civil War was very hard on them. It was a bloody period for the Tamils. So, for a while, it looked like he was just going to stay in power. He was also pretty corrupt, it would seem. That was sort of the allegation that was levied against him. He was it really seemed like he was trying to build a dynasty in Sri Lanka's government. And he had a lot of popularity because he was the guy who won the war. Mind you, the Sri Lankan Civil War had been waged for like 30 years before it ended. So it was definitely like a problem. So being able to finish it, and finish it successfully, was a big political boost for him. But he seemed like a pseudo-authoritarian, and it seemed like he was kind of putting the country on a bad path, basically. That was the criticism. But in the next election, he actually lost. And he actually lost against a guy who had been in his own party, and who left his party and teamed up with an opposition party. And that guy was named Sirisena, I think. I hope somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I believe his name was Sirisena. And that was seen as like a big dramatic betrayal, because he'd been an underling in Rajapaksa's party for a long time, but he kind of turned on him and ran on a platform that was much more conciliatory towards the Tamils and that was anti-corruption and etc. It was kind of a shock win. Everybody fully expected Rajapaksa to just stay in power forever, pretty much. People did not have high expectations of Sri Lanka's political institutions and political culture to kind of deflect all of that pressure. But it did. And everybody was just kind of pleasantly surprised for a long time. But Sirisena was never really able to implement deep reforms. And then late last year, there was some new drama, which is that Sirisena basically de facto accused the leader of his major coalition partner of trying to kill him. It was a weird, bizarre episode, and it actually involved the Indian Secret Service. The Indian Secret Service was accused of plotting with, this group, this guy's political partner, to assassinate him. And of course the Indians denied it completely. Supposedly, the theory was that Sirisena was getting a little too close with the Chinese and Chinese investment. This is after the whole port imbroglio, where the Sri Lankan government basically signed over a major port to Chinese state-owned actor in exchange for debt forgiveness. So that's the theory anyway. That's anybody's guess whether or not it's true. But the point is, there was a falling out between the major coalition partners. And Sirisena responded to that by trying to remove the president. Now, he himself was the prime minister, and that's pretty much the principal power in Sri Lanka. But he tried to remove the president, who's kind of also pretty powerful and has a lot of influence, I think, in the legislature. Is that what it was? Actually, I've got it backwards. He was the president, and he tried to remove the prime minister. I think that's what it was. And he tried to remove the prime minister, and he replaced him with Rajapaksa, which shocked the hell out of everybody. Like, they were supposed to be these bitter political enemies after Sirisena backstabbed him. But now all of a sudden, he's back in power. He's trying to put him in a significant position of authority in his own government, and nobody really knew why. I mean, if there's a falling out with a coalition partner, sure, you can kind of push them out and try to find a new partner, but Rajapaksa, that was a really weird choice, and nobody really knew what to make of that. So then there was a huge shitstorm, though, because one of the things that the Sirisena government had done after he won election is institute a number of constitutional changes that made the presidency less powerful, because that had been one of the big criticisms of Rajapaksa, that he was centralizing too much power in the executive branch. So Sirisena and his people kind of passed legislation that dealt with that and moved power away back towards the legislature. Well, the power that Rajapaksa used to remove the prime minister was actually one of the powers that had been removed by the constitutional changes that his people had implemented before. So it was actually unconstitutional. So all of these people who supported his coalition partner that he had turned on started protesting, and they actually occupied, I think, the governor's mansion. Not the governor's mansion, but something else. The Capitol building or some damn thing. And so then it went to the courts, and so there was this big question about whether or not Sri Lanka's judicial institutions, specifically its Supreme Court, would be able to kind of navigate this, and whether or not Sri Lankan civil society would be able to manage the fallout, whichever way it ended up ruling. So everybody was on pins and needles for a couple weeks while that was sorted out. Originally, I think the original plan for Sirisena was to basically buy time for Rajapaksa to get enough political support in Parliament to pass a vote of no confidence, because that's basically what the opposition immediately did. They tried to pass a vote to say that they had no confidence in the government, and that they could not, and that the government could not remove the prime minister in the way that they had. So, if Rajapaksa could have passed that vote, he could have hypothetically stayed in power. And so presumably there was a lot of, negotiating, under the table deals, that kind of thing, the usual kind of stuff that corrupt politicians engage in, normal kind of stuff in a lot of societies. But they were not able to get the votes they needed. And so Rajapaksa did not pass the vote. In fact, I don't even think they ended up allowing the vote to happen. I think they just delayed it further. And so it basically just came down to the Constitutional Court to rule on the matter. And so the Constitutional Court ruled that it was, in fact, explicitly unconstitutional. And so after that ruling, Rajapaksa was forced to step down, and power was returned to the original prime minister. And Sirisena kind of looked like an ass a bit for trying to make a power play of exactly the kind that his political party had that he had been elected to try to do away with. He had been explicitly elected as an anti-corruption candidate, and then here he is basically just completely rescinding that and trying to take power. And again, it's not really clear why. The whole thing was utterly bizarre. It really came right out of left field. And I haven't read anything that really thoroughly explains that yet.
By left field, do you mean a Christopher Nolan Batman movie? Because I distinctly remember Harvey Dent saying, either you die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you're talking about, right?
Pretty much. He kind of became that. So he was in for a lot of heat after that. But Rajapaksa has always been relatively popular. You know, he still has that core of support that he got for winning the war, basically. Lots of war veterans and other people who support him for being a very nationalistic, conservative candidate. So he still rides a lot of that. He still has significant influence in Sri Lanka. But there's enough other factions in Sri Lanka that don't like the way that he was governing, especially not the dynastic style that he was using, or the corruption, you know, or the way he treated minority groups, that they were able to kind of push him out. But it seems like either he's trying to push his way back in, and it didn't work this time, or Sirisena is having something. Again, it's not clear just what the hell went on there. That's kind of something to watch for, too, because something like this could happen again. You know, whatever it was that pushed him to do that could push him to try something else. So everybody's kind of watching Sri Lanka, kind of wondering what the hell is happening there. But on the other, you know, on the upside, it was definitely a victory for Sri Lanka's civil society and its judicial institutions, because they were able to kind of successfully weather that challenge. And everybody respected their authority in doing so. So that was all a significant win, you know, for Sri Lanka as a country and in terms of its historical, political development. So kind of a silver lining there, I guess. Did you win?
Yes, I did, actually.
Nice.
Yeah, the enemy tried to attack me and I was attacking them, and it was just a chaotic situation. And usually, I think of it like in either it's an old samurai movie or anime where two swordsmen clash, and then there's like a pause and it's like, wait, who's gonna die? And like one person falls over. That's basically what happened, and the other person died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll see that on replay later.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a bunch of relatively tough games today. If you get... So I play on Europe server whenever we're doing this segment. And I am trying to listen to you as well. And since it's kind of late at night, you have some of those young whippersnapper EU players who are really trying to take a shot at the title and move the ladder. And they just woke up, they had their morning routine, they're ready to just kick some ass and move up. And I'm at like 9.5 hours in. I'm trying to listen to you talk about Sri Lanka, and the chat is kind of rolling. I try to read that every once in a while, and yeah, you lose some games, but I think some people just like to see the sort of pieces move in StarCraft and aren't super critical. It's cool to see some people who don't normally talk about political stuff or history, and they open up about it. Overall, it's been a super awesome segment. I'm glad we got another one in. Sorry about the delay. I'm not a streamer who keeps a schedule. You're basically the only anchor that we really have in terms of Sunday evening. Agent Smith sometimes happens. That's the closest thing I have to a schedule.
Well, no problem. You know, anytime, you know. You do what you got to do. Whatever is good for the business.
Yeah, I have the brute force method where it's not the most crisp and reliable and consistent business plan. I just put in more hours than the competition, so the viewership doesn't have as much room to complain.
Hard work is always a good strategy.
Yeah, efficiency would go a long way. I don't plan stuff. That's kind of my weak point as a person. It's just like, if we just spam enough effort, then it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, a very American approach.
Hell yeah. Well, I think this is episode 45, so we're getting pretty close to the big 5-0, which is hype. And the viewership has gone up during this segment. So a lot of times some people are like, Yeah, I like StarCraft, but I'm not really into politics. We went from about 1,000 viewers, now we have 1,300 viewers.
Hmm.
So you're doing something right, or at least you're not doing bad enough to make them run away. One of those.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I think that's the first time we've had that.
Yeah. So cheers, everyone who stuck around and enjoyed this. We try to do this every Sunday. It's been a few Sundays off. That's my fault, not his. You basically always say yes. I think there have only been one or two times when you said there was something going on and you couldn't do it, but
Sounds about right.
yeah. Well, thanks everyone for your really awesome questions, and Fuzzy Cord for passing those along. The other mods for helping people out figure out, is this a podcast? Is this live? What is he listening to? Wow. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Cheers. Another good episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Good stuff.
See you next time. Sweet action.